So good morning and welcome to the second meeting of the Rural Affairs and Islands Committee in 2026. Before we begin, can we remind everyone to turn their electronic devices to silent. Just to put on record, Emma Harper will be joining us remotely today. So our first item on the agenda is an evidence session on the Scottish Government's draft climate change plan. And this week we're going to focus on the agricultural chapter of the plan, the draft plan, by taking evidence from two panels of witnesses. Firstly, we'll hear from a panel of stakeholders from the agriculture sector, and welcome to the meeting Emma Patterson-Taylor, the project manager from Scottish Agriculture Organisation Society. We have Donna Smith, the chief executive of the Scottish Crofting Federation. Lorna Scott, the Senior Policy Manager for Climate, Land and Business from the National Farmers Union of Scotland, and Nim Kibler, the Scottish Manager for Nature Friendly Farming Networks, and today representing the Scottish Agroecology Partnership. And just to say that Edward Mountain, MSP, will be joining us later in the meeting, and he will have the opportunity to ask questions at the end of our question session. So, just before we begin, as always, sadly, in this committee, we're limited for time this morning, so can ask members and participants to be succinct with their questions and their answers. And just to remind you, you'll not need to operate your microphones. This gentleman here will do that for you. So, I'll kick off with a fairly broad question. Emissions from the agricultural sector have broadly remained stable since 2020, despite earlier predictions of decline. So what do you see as the main reason for the gap between policy expectations and on-farm outcomes? Who'd like to kick off? Donna.
Oh. Well, I guess broadly speaking, it's probably because although there are high-level policy intentions, we haven't seen that follow through into what's been delivered in terms of agricultural support, and where things might change to encourage folk to change their working practices. We seem to be stuck largely on a as-you-were kind of basis. So I suspect that's what's driving that lack of change.
Okay.
Can I jump in?
Emma?
Yeah, no, I mean, I would echo that point, and I suppose, you know, there's policy expectations, and then there's the industry doing what it does. And I guess if policy wants industry to change, they have to implement policy that will engender change in the industry. It doesn't really work to just have a sort of general expectation and hope the industry will follow. And farming in particular looks for very clear signals around what they're expected to do in a long-term way, and those haven't really been given in any significant way, I would argue.
Thank you. Lorna?
Yeah, I suppose also it's important to recognise that agriculture will always produce some form of emissions just by its very nature, so that it's important to just emphasise that we should be seeking to reach net zero for the sector rather than absolute zero. And also, you know, but significant efforts can be made in terms of efficiencies in the sector, but also it's helpful to it would be helpful to take into account the sequestration that happens on farm already through soils, peatlands, on-farm woodlands, hedgerows, grasslands, etc., which isn't accounted for at the moment as the two are separated.
The committee has discussed this previously. We had a route map, we had agriculture reform, but it's not clear what that is delivering or what the pathway is. We've heard about falling off a cliff, but the road has certainly come to an end because there's no clear indication. The NFUS have said that, and I think that it comes in good time because we had the budget yesterday, and the NFUS have said that the budget fell short of what was required to deliver food, climate and nature outcomes, and essentially flatlines vital direct support. Is that one of the factors in why the emissions decline hasn't continued and more flatlined? Is it because there's not the funding there to back it up, or is it more to do with policy confidence?
It'll be a combination. I think we've only got the budget yesterday, so we're still going through that, and we need to have a bit more time to process that properly. But I think we need to be aware of how many different things we're trying to deliver through agriculture now. It's it's food production to make sure that we're onshoring those emissions, we're not offshoring them through imports, which would be a significant negative environmental impact, which I think we need to recognise, but also wider socio-economic, the role of agriculture more widely in rural Scotland is fundamental. So yes, it's difficult. We need more information on policy, and obviously financial support is crucial to incentivising further action. Yeah, it is a challenge, and the sector's increasingly expected to deliver on really, really huge outcomes.
Nim, in recent weeks we heard of the resignation of members of RSPB and Environmental Link from the ARIOB panel that was the go-to body for setting or helping informing future policy or whatever. How do you feel, how confident do you feel that the government have in place the right people to deliver at pace? Because ultimately, the longer it takes to put policies in place, the further and harder the policies have got to hit. So do you think of inaction over the last 5 years has led to that decline in emission reduction?
Fundamentally, yes. So I think we have this issue regarding ambition actually versus the reality gap of implementation. So the climate change plan, as it's outlined here, relies heavily on agricultural reform programme to deliver that, and tools such as whole farm planning. But the way that they've been in these delivery routes and tools, they're just too slow. The roadmap has kind of lost confidence with the industry. It's too fragmented, and basically that can't underpin long-term business planning if you don't know where we're going after 2030. And I guess the other thing is also when we look at documents like the plan in place, we have unrealistic uptake assumptions for the agricultural sector. So in the analytical annex, it assumes a 45% uptake of mitigation measures. That's not achievable within farms with the way that the industry is responding at present to the challenges that it's facing. So without a credible roadmap or stronger incentives, it's always just going to be an assumption rather than an actual plan.
So my final question before we move on, given yesterday's budget, in which the organisations like the Scottish Land and Estate have said they've got little confidence for rural businesses who are being asked to deliver climate and community outcomes, given the flat line in the budget. Individually, do you believe that the gap between policy expectations and on-farm outcomes, is it going to narrow or is it going to increase as part of this climate change plan and the effects of yesterday's budget? Do you expect it to get bigger or smaller? I'll start with Lorna.
Well, that's difficult to say. Like I say, we'd need to go through the budget a bit more kind of clearly. We just saw it yesterday. I think
the organisation says it falls short.
Yes, I know. I think, again, it's like about these multiple outcomes that we're expected to deliver. And also, just in terms of climate, yes, there's mitigation, but increasingly there's adaptation that we're seeing as really vital for business resilience going forward. And I think the investment there needed over the long term is only ever going to increase. So it's just about where we're putting this investment in place for businesses to remain sustainable and profitable is really important, but the pressures are significant.
Okay. Donna?
Yes, again, we haven't had time to look at the budget properly, but I guess the core issue here is that we have the ARP Act. We've, as an organisation, repeatedly pointed to the shortcomings there, and despite all the kind of rhetoric around sustainable and regenerative agriculture, there still isn't a plan of how people achieve that. So it's hard to say, looking at the budget, whether it will or won't. But for instance, we're still maintaining the level of payments, basic payments, but we're not diverting more money to agri-environment schemes and things like that. So until you see a shift like that, there won't be a shift broadly across agriculture because, as everyone said, no one knows where they need to try and focus their energies. And you know, we have the whole farm plan was brought in, and that was touted as a measure to reduce emissions. But it's not working. In the first year, certainly in a crofting context, we've seen that a lot of the whole farm plan elements don't help you achieve any improvements. And actually, all it's done in the first year is filled the pockets of a lot of agricultural consultants who've been paid to do plans for people that tell them they can't really improve anything. And we would argue that maybe the carbon audits and things like that aren't using all the right information and then processing that to give people the right advice to make changes. So there has been a lot of talk. The budget, to me, the budget's sort of neither here nor there. We need to look at the budget and make sure that the money is pointed in the right direction. At the minute, it's all pointing to the status quo, effectively. So therefore, how is there going to be any change resulting from that?
Thanks. So, Emma, same question to you. Do you have any confidence the gap between policy ambitions and actually on-farm outcomes, that gap when it comes to climate change is going to narrow?
Yeah, no, I don't. I mean, I would echo what Don has just said, and also say I don't think the budget probably, I can't really comment on the budget, but I also don't think it is the critical thing. I think the critical thing is what's actually in the climate change legislation and what are you compelling people to do. And if you aren't driving a real meaningful shift there, then it just won't happen. And I don't think we're seeing any evidence that there is strong enough drivers in there to have any kind of shift happening in a meaningful way at industry level.
Okay, thank you. Nem?
Yeah, I think we've also got real issues around, you know, having high-level look at the budget. I also think that when we then look at what it is that we need to do as an industry, we just don't seem to be in agreement as well. And there needs to be this real understanding of what, you know, efficiency is going to be in a farming context as well, rather than, you know, and how that's going to lead to climate change mitigation. But I think, you know, making sure that businesses continue to be profitable in the sector, but also we've got a lot of people already doing a lot of things. There is just not, the policy isn't reflecting that. There would, you know, if we put in some of the things that I mentioned in the ambition, there'd be like quite a lot of farmers that would come in with already quite high baselines on achieving, you know, carbon sequestration, animal welfare, in line with, you know, some of our climate challenge changes. But we're just not reflecting that ambition in the industry.
Okay, thank you. We're now going to look at some of the policies in more detail. A question from Emma Roddick.
Thanks, Convener. Yeah, Emma, you in particular touched on it there around, you know, what's missing in terms of driving change in a policy sense. Are there any that you think are particularly missing from the climate change plan?
I think what's missing is, you know, the kind of list of mitigation measures, and I can't remember how many there are, but, you know, there's a whole host of those, and that has, pulling those in has been delayed. So that's all been pushed down the road. So none of them are there. There isn't a kind of, right now we go farmers, you know, select from this menu, start implementing, start measuring. That can has been kicked. So I suppose that would be my issue, really, is that that delay means that you're going to have, you're going to lose time in terms of the industry. And also, you know, as Nim just said, there's lots of things farmers are actually doing now, which could then start being reflected now if that was happening.
Okay, so is there maybe just some kind of resource missing between the plan and the end user to say, this is how you actually reach that by, you know, this date that seems really far away?
Well, I suppose I know you can't go back in time, so it's not helpful to talk too much about that. But I suppose I would say there's a missed opportunity with that delay. That, to me, is the biggest issue. If you're trying to resolve that in some way, you could talk about trying to bring that in sooner and start discussing those measures sooner. Because I think, you know, I think at a government level, they've been quite clear there won't be any kind of penalty or lost time. You know, if it's not like they're saying to farmers, oh, don't do this and then suddenly do it in 2030. So it's like, well, let's start talking about this now then, you know, and get a head start. Because I worry about this 2030 Neverland of, oh, and then suddenly. Because that's what climate change has felt like for the last 10 years, really. So, oh, suddenly we will arrive and these things will happen. And it just doesn't, in any sector, and agriculture possibly particularly. It doesn't work like that.
Yeah, I think that's a really key thing, actually, which is just that, you know, the change is already happening at the farm level. Climate change is happening. It is changing how we farm, how, you know, crops respond, how certain inputs to the farm work or don't work. You know, we've also got, you know, significant changes in markets that we're just not responding to at the policy level to actually get our farm businesses, like, environmentally resilient and thus economically resilient for the future.
Anyone else like to come in? Lorna?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose it would help, kind of what we've already touched on, is recognising the work that's already being done within these audits or these assessments would really help. I mean, I can speak about my own carbon audit on my farm where we have peatland and woodland on farm, and we put the woodland in specifically for livestock shelter, for better water management, and so on, obviously apart from the carbon storage benefits. But those benefits aren't accounted for anywhere within my farm assessment. And particularly if we're thinking about mitigation, it's not within the carbon audit at all. And I just think it would help promote confidence within the industry where they feel they're being recognised and rewarded for what they're already achieving. I think that would definitely help.
Okay, thank you. Any further questions, Emma? No. Hey, Alistair Allen.
Thank you, Convener. As you've mentioned, all of you, that the kind of national vision around reducing carbon emissions from agriculture and involve reform, i.e. change on the part of farmers and crofters. I wonder if you could maybe say a wee bit about whether you, to what extent you feel, you've kind of answered this, but to what extent you feel that's a realistic aim, but also to give some practical examples of what the sector is actually doing by way of reforming its practices that might help it get there.
Nim?
So I think this is the question of resource efficiency. What concerns me when I was reading through this climate change plan is, are we just talking about technological solutions to a high input business as usual model of farming and crofting and growing in Scotland, which is not necessarily favourable for the Scottish environment nor the food and feed and industries that we actually produce for? And so I think we really need to kind of redefine this efficiency as resource efficiency, not just maximum output per unit. And I think if we continue down that kind of, as much as we can, you know, grub out of the land, we're going to find ourselves in real danger in the next few years. And we are not going to account for carbon sequestration, soil regeneration, healthy livestock that then produce less emissions, local food that's not trucked around the country to get processed at one end of the country and then back to feed someone else somewhere else. Or we are going to go to sort of green shed, you know, smart sheds, and we're going to offshore all of our emissions somewhere else, which is completely morally irreprehensible, really.
Anyone else? Donna?
Yeah, I mean, I sort of back that up, and you know, we keep saying that there appears no plan. There is no firm plan at the minute to make any significant changes to agricultural support until 2030. So therefore, we're not sure how the 2030 milestone in any route map will deliver any meaningful change. And we're also concerned that maybe agricultural reform at the moment isn't looking at that full holistic picture. You know, so we're talking there about all the good things that are happening, and they're not taken into account at the minute in the information that people have been asked to provide. And we're not really talking about multifunctional land use, you know, for food production, carbon storage, nature restoration, water management, all those things. But as Nim has touched on there, it seems to be a focus on efficiency by means of higher throughput and technical fixes. And technical fixes are not going to work for everybody. I mean, if you take the crofting context, you know, crofters are generally not using machinery and stuff like that. They're already operating in a sort of high nature value extensive system that needs to be recognised and encouraged, and perhaps we could see more of that across the country without having to, you know, employ technology to achieve great strides forward. So I think there's just muddled messaging, and there isn't a clear path, as we're all going to keep saying. I think there is not a clear path as we sit here at the minute of how people are going to move towards the things that we want to achieve. So, yeah.
Convener, you mentioned that there were, you mentioned some of the things that the sector is doing off its own bat, if you like, to reach these aims. I appreciate the separate point you're making about government support and so on, but it would be interesting for the committee just to hear a wee bit about the things that the sector itself is doing to reform itself, if you like.
So I guess our thing is the holistic context of, you know, your lives, you know, it's very difficult to do this sometimes because there's a lot of different growing and farming contexts in Scotland. So when I'm going, do I talk about dairy? But then that can be quite
just looking for a few examples.
Yeah. So I guess we focus on the soil and we work up from there in terms of healthy soil supports the rest of the system, and we work on that agroecological basis. I don't think in a farming context we don't agree that soil health isn't the driving factor on our farm. I think we're unanimous in that. But there, and I guess it's that thing of thinking of the farm as a whole, and the whole farm plan was supposed to be the tool that kind of got us collectively and nationally as an industry looking in that context. But the way it's been delivered has pushed people away from that, unfortunately. And yeah, it's created concern.
Okay. Supplementary. Oh, sorry, Emma.
No, not at all. I suppose I almost want to answer that question with a slight repeat of going, until there's a really clear steer from government, you'll see quite a strong degree of hesitancy across the board in farming. It doesn't mean there aren't individual farms doing lots and lots. There absolutely is. But you will definitely continue to see that until they get a clear steer. And in terms of the measures, I would say, you know, echoing Lorna's point, there's kind of, on the one side, there's kind of two sides of the coin. There's all the sequestration stuff, which farmers are really frustrated about because it's not accounted for and isn't acknowledged, which does need dealing with in some way, I would argue. And then there's the kind of mitigation measures that are coming but aren't here yet. And I would say there's a real issue with the mitigation measures which could achieve emissions, which would be represented in the inventory, but they're not tested yet. So those mitigation measures are still a little arbitrary. There is a list, it's, you know, academically agreed upon as all holding value, but because we aren't doing it yet, we don't really know to what degree in Scotland those are going to give good wins. The sector will continue to be efficient and drive its own efficiencies in its own ways. Some of those will achieve climate change aims, but until there's a stronger, clear steer, they will hold a financial focus as much as anything else, because the businesses have to survive.
Okay, supplementary from Ariane.
Nim, you talked about soil being a driving factor in terms of the particular, you used the word holistic, the holistic practice that you and other farmers in Nature Friendly Farming Network practice. And it was interesting. So in the, I think it's the whole farm plan, there's one, right, there's a soil test that farmers can opt into on a voluntary basis. But what was surprising to me that farmers actually don't test their soil, but if soil is the driving factor, and that's an optional thing at the moment, I just wonder what more do we need in place, because if there's a spectrum of people who have never tested their soil all the way to people like, I can't remember his first name, but Mr. Griffin, who's down in the borders, who tests his soil to an incredible level. So we've got that spectrum. What more would we need to support farmers to move into really understanding that soil really is the direct driving factor in terms of support or training, that kind of thing?
I think it's there, and I think it's coming through the industry. I don't think we need to worry too much. There'll always be a sort of recalcitrant bunch within any industry who don't want to change, and that's fine. Let them do what they want to do. You can't bring everyone with you. And I guess I think the main thing is that, you know, actually the uptake of things like soil testing, that climate change mitigation and sequestration, it depends on the ARP development. So those driving things from also co-op and cooperation and collaboration at the farm level. And so part of what Scottish Government needs to do in the Tier 4 stuff that is developing is reassess the farming advisory and support landscape to make sure that we are all learning from each other, and rather than allowing us to polarise and fight over the budget like we're all going away and doing our assessments yesterday, actually get in the room together and work out what's practical, because we're all practical folk at the end of the day.
Okay, thanks.
I've got a feeling there's a lack of enthusiasm. This is really flat, which makes me think everybody's sort of shrugging their shoulders. This is an incredibly important document that we're scrutinising, because it could set out the pressures that will be in agriculture over the next 10, 15 years. And we're going to have to report on this as a matter of urgency. So Alistair's question is really, really important, and it's going to be important to your members. Because the government sees agricultural reform as the most important driver for emissions reduction. But from you guys, I'm just getting sort of, I really don't know. We've had 10 years at this. So I'm going to ask specifically, Lorna, your members, do you believe that the current programme that's in front of us is capable of delivering the scale of change that we need to see, which this climate change plan sets out? Because we need to know more, because as a committee we're going to have to pull together a report on this, and ultimately in a few weeks' time we're going to have to vote on whether this climate change plan is fit for purpose, because we're at a climate crisis. So, and we need to get a little bit more, and I'm not being disrespectful, you're sort of shrugging shoulders and go, well, we are where we are and we're doing a bit of this and a bit of that. This is absolutely critical. We need to find out whether you believe your members think what we've got in place here is capable of delivering what the government expects of the industry.
Yeah, I think it's going to be a challenge. I think we need to kind of keep at the forefront that these are businesses that need to be profitable in order to survive, in order to then deliver on these outcomes that we're talking about. So first and foremost, that is what is important. I think in coming back to the soils point, that's a good example of where that's a win-win for business and the environment. If we get, and we are seeing a big uptake in our membership and kind of across the industry, of folk doing that on farm and on the ground to make sure that they're spreading the right fertiliser or minerals that is needed in their soils, because it improves the fertility and it's just good across the board, and we are seeing a good uptake in that. So I think more things where that is possible, where we're seeing multiple benefits from a business perspective and an environmental, is really where we're going to see more uptake and better results. Yeah, it is a challenge. I think, again, viewing it kind of as we've all spoken about more holistically is going to be beneficial. Sequestration is really important, the investment and doing things, you know, I'm sure we're going to come into on-farm woodlands and things like that, but in a kind of integrated manner where, again, we're getting those multi-benefits for business resilience and also for the environment are going to be important. But it is a challenge, and I would echo what we've seen in what we've spoken about in terms of technology stuff. It's just at the moment not really economically viable, and also it's developing, so it's difficult to get a measure on how effective that will be.
Okay, I'm going to move on. The question from Emma Harper, which it kind of follows on from my questions. Emma.
Yeah, thanks, Convener. It does actually follow on, because I think I would be interested to find out what specifically is that we need to see in the rural support plan that supports actions that the government want to take forward in the climate change plan. So, like specific information in the support plan that would make you confident that agricultural policy will be provided with a clear direction of travel for agriculture and to support a just transition for low carbon farming. I know there's a lot of farms out there that are achieving a lot. There's anaerobic digestion plants on the dairy farms in the southwest of Scotland, using their own digestate, creating biogas, and you know, actually using that as part of achieving their net zero goals. So I'd be interested to hear specifically what we need to see in the rural support plan.
Nim, do you want to kick off?
Yeah, sorry, I'm slightly... What do we need to see in the rural support plan? I guess this comes down to all of our members in SAP would say that essentially when you're looking at agriculture in this context, it's an issue of rural and just transition. So it's an issue of rural justice. And at the moment, I think we're seeing too many urban copy and paste solutions for the rural environments. The technology is not developing at the rate that it needs to, and what is being developed by the agri-tech industry will not work necessarily in all Scottish contexts because it's driven towards high input, you know, intensification machinery that is going to be unaffordable unless government steps in and either supports that R&D or sort of supports machinery rings and things like that to actually, you know, move towards that net zero thing. The other issue that we have is that in SAP we represent a lot of smaller farmers, growers, family farms, and a lot of them will continue to work on their own interpretations of what climate change and climate mitigating farms will do, but they will opt out of subsidies and the tools that government uses to drive that change because they are disillusioned with it, which is why we're all a bit meh.
Okay. Yeah. Emma?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose I'm wanting to come back to your point of, you know, kind of saying, oh, we're sitting here sort of shrugging shoulders, and that's flatness that you're picking up on. So forgive me, I'm just going to be quite direct, and also forgive me, Lorna, on this. Okay, so we have quite a little industry which has a strong lobbying organisation that is very close to its minister. It's very important to the minister and very important to the industry that this relationship works. It's pretty tight. It's always been tricky for Scottish Government and ministers to deviate too far from the voice of the industry in that role, in that function. So it tends not to do it. So this is tricky because then what happens is, and I don't want to go all Mary Poppins on you, but it's like taking your medicine, right? Mary Poppins needs enough distance from the children in order to make sure that what needs to happen happens. You stay too close and too tight. You only do what the industry is going to be able to publicly say that they are willing to do. And the level of that is always going to be less ambitious than it needs to be. Because we know across sectors, but particularly here, that leap cannot happen if you just do what people say and can say publicly that they're willing to do. Because they have big membership groups, we all have membership bodies, we all have interests that we need to take care of and be mindful of. But that's why you've got a climate change plan that isn't ambitious enough and that is delayed way too far to 2030. So in terms of what needs to be in the plan, the measures that are hopefully coming in 2030, they need to be in the plan. That's tricky. That's not a thing that everyone's going to agree with and say, yes, please, bring this in, bring it sooner. But that's the problem you're seeing. And you're probably seeing it across sectors, but you are also seeing it here.
I'm going to come to the other members, but Emma Rodericks, I think, has got a supplementary in this response.
Yeah, I do. I just wanted to pick up on that and kind of go down a slight tangent. Are there issues within that voice that you're talking about of different areas of Scotland maybe not getting their say or not being factored into policies like this? Is that a concern that you have?
It's not particularly, but I'm not saying that I would be the authoritative voice to know if that is or isn't happening. The issue that I feel more keenly, kind of, you know, over the last 16 years working in agriculture, is that observation of it's tricky when, and I work for Scottish Government as well, when government and ministers are close to an industry, and then what you do about that. So I'm not really feeling like, oh, this is misrepresentation or people are being missed out. It's more like sometimes you have to lead, and that means stepping out and beyond and doing things that are frankly unpopular. it's, yeah, you can't always be liked, sadly. And that has consequences, and we all have elections, so I do know the dilemma is real. Yeah.
Does that highlight, shine a spotlight on the failure of the likes of ARIOB? So co-development actually is just smoke and mirrors, because there's a necessity for the industry to work or be seen to be work closely with government.
Yeah, it doesn't have to be, and it's okay to work closely. I think that's great to have that relationship. I think that's really positive. It's just that you then still need to be able to hold a line. It can't be that the line blurs and just, yeah. And I think, yeah, it's a dilemma. It is.
Thank you. Donna?
Yeah, so that's kind of back to the point I made earlier about when we look at the agriculture budget, you know, we're still sitting X years down the line with the vast majority of payments going to people just because they have land, rather than more being aimed at how they're going to change their practices to do that. You know, so, you know, make agri-environment climate schemes more of a focus, make them more accessible to smaller units, because at the minute, you know, it's quite difficult for small units and crofts to get onto EECs because they don't get enough points because they're not doing things at scale, but they might be able to achieve really good things with that support. You know, so we have to, there's been no shift at all, and I think that's the frustration, and we need to, you know, so we all got the rural payment, the rural support plan published there before Christmas, and all it does is say exactly what we're already doing and what we've been doing for the last few years. There's no shift there, and we're now talking about no shift till 2030. So that's where the frustration comes from. I think people do want to do stuff, and people are doing great stuff, and they're not acknowledged and rewarded for that. They keep getting told that when the new support systems change, that they will be rewarded for the good stuff they're doing, but there's no change. So I think that's where the frustration comes from. And you're right, we are all a bit like, phew, but it's because there's no clear indicators yet of where people need to head. And the people that are doing the good stuff, I think, feel just more and more frustrated that nobody's recognising the work that they're already doing. So we just seem to be stuck. And we need to get unstuck if any of this is actually going to move and achieve anything.
Sorry, Lorna, would you like to come in?
Yeah, just I suppose to say that, yeah, the delivery is going to be through the future support framework, like what Donna's just said. So we really need to see, you know, what those policies are going to look like, and also where the funding is going to be allocated, in order to better understand how this can be delivered and what farmers and crofters are going to be expected to do. Otherwise, I suppose, on Emma's point, I think it's important that industry and government do work together, and we'll continue to be collaborative and constructive as much as possible. Our whole job is to represent our members' views, and we take that very seriously. So, of course, we're going to try and do that as much as possible.
Tim Eagle.
Thank you. Donna, sorry, did you see a copy of the rural support plan? Because that hasn't been published. Have you seen a copy in the background?
I've seen a draft copy.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
Have we seen a draft copy? I think we've seen a draft copy. If anybody wants to send that on, please feel free, because I would love to see a draft copy of the rural support plan. Can I just pick up on this? So, because I'm sitting here, I mean, I probably should declare an interest. I'm an active farmer. Well, I say myself an active farmer. I've got barely anything left. But, I mean, I feel I've done, and I feel my neighbours have done, everything we've been asked to do for the last 20 years. I mean, we were members of the Countryside Premium Scheme, the Environmental Stewardship Scheme, the EEC schemes, you know, just Tiers 1 and Tiers 2 constantly. So I guess then, so there's kind of this thing then saying ministers aren't making the tough decisions they need to make. But equally, would you, because you're obviously still going through the budget, but I had a quick look at the budget yesterday. The big numbers don't lie. There's been no change in the budget at all. So when we come into that just transition question that we sort of hinged upon there at the end, there's just not the money either, is there? Because actually you can't have that cliff edge. I think that's the point NFUF has always made, isn't it? If you have that cliff edge, then actually you get a devastation of crofters and farmers across Scotland, because loads of people just fall off. And then what does that look like? So I guess then, in order to get what you all seem to be driving at, you do think there needs to be that extra bit, that just transition funding as well that comes into place?
Donna. So I think there just has to be some movement. You know, there's been no movement. So yeah, I don't think any of us are saying let's now suddenly jump to a cliff edge. But there's been a period of years where there could have been a gradual shift of funding from, you know,
Tier 1
land-based to something else. But there's been no shift.
Yeah.
So let's start to see a gradual shift. And even if we look at this year, so we had the FFIS scheme, which was, you know, a great opportunity for folk. But you know, let's face it. I think we all accept now it was rushed. It maybe wasn't well designed. And looking at the figures, though, it seems like a lot of the awards went to, you know, to fund sort of intensive precision farming rather than sort of reliant on technology and stuff like that, rather than maybe focusing on sort of more sustainable regenerative things. So we need to be, there just seems to be mixed messages and there is no shift. We're stuck paying the vast majority of people for just having the land in Tier 1, but not seeing any of that money start to shift to support change. Let's see it shift.
Yeah, and there's no need for a cliff edge. I think that's exactly the point. And I think a sense of fear around cliff edge and, oh goodness, people lost, you know, industries crashing, people moving out of rural communities that we want them to be in. That has caused a sort of a paralysing fear, it feels like to me, which then means, oh, well, we mustn't have a cliff edge, so we will defer. We will continue to defer. And that's a climate change dilemma across the board. But it is really real here, and leadership is required. You know, there hasn't really been change. I think Donna's right. So, and I forgive this addition, but you know, you were saying you've done everything, and I don't mean this in a personal sense. Yes, but I think I think maybe what we're trying to say here is what has been there has not been enough.
Okay.
Yeah, I want to talk about this cliff edge thing. And there is this, you know, I think it's difficult for us in the industry at the moment because there is this sense of intense fear and worry that's coming from our members. But I also think that's been used to avoid change. And change is happening environmentally and in markets and in the environment that all of our farmers are operating within. And I guess I kind of find it slight fun that we're talking not about carbon capture now, but about policy capture and whether that's a factor in this as well. And I think, you know, Tim, I'd love to come to your farm and see what holistic approach we could have a look at.
So can I ask one more? We've had the Minister in here a couple of times that's talking about, and he often, and I don't want to get too political here, but would often sort of say, oh, but have you seen what's happened down in England? It's all a disaster. But England have made a very, very big change, so have Wales for that matter. Now, you know, constitutional question aside, can any of you reflect on that then? Like, do you think then that whether or not you agree with everything they're doing, the fact that they have made a big change, do you see that as a positive then? Do you think Scotland has kind of held itself back by not being prepared to make that big change? I'm not saying I agree with that, by the way, but I'm just curious of any thoughts.
Yes, we have held ourselves back by not being willing to make a change. And I'm not commenting on saying, oh, we should do what England did or, you know, any of that. But basically, yes, because we obviously want the change to be right. But if there isn't anything, then you're in a kind of stasis, which I think is why, yeah, you're getting the kind of energy you are from us.
The energy's picking up, I think.
Well, great, wonderful, but that needs to go somewhere.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, my feeling is that we've got an agriculture bill that was passed last year, and it's yet really to be implemented. But the flagship policy within that for the Scottish Government was that they were retaining basic payments at a percentage, 70%. But this year we've seen effectively that cut in real terms. So there is no additional support whatsoever for climate change or a just transition. And the 70% of the total agricultural budget is dropped, but it's not targeted. So it would appear that going forward there's going to be a lot more stick than there is going to be carrot to encourage farmers to do the right things, which is really concerning. So that the rural support plan is really going to have to pull a rabbit out of the bag to allow the industry to deliver what the government think is the primary driver for achieving our climate targets. Nim?
Yeah, so I think that's a good point in that, we've talked a bit about, obviously budget yesterday, and that the public purse strings for the stick and for the carrot. There's less stick and there's less carrot than there used to be around. And I think one of the things that we need to talk about a little bit as well is about in the reduction of public support to drive the change that we need, and how to balance that with subsidy and business security for our members. How we also then look after them as a government, as a nation, against private finance as that comes in to fill that void. And I don't think we're having enough of that discussion at the moment.
Thank you. I'm going to move on to a question from Ariane Burgess.
Thanks, Convener. Very interesting conversation so far, and I can potentially predict the answers to this question. So the plan assumes that around 45% of farmers will take up low carbon emissions, with most of that happening after 2030. And I guess we can kind of read into the 2030 number as that's like the year before the next election. So there's going to be a lot of work. I think the government's assuming there's going to be a lot of work done from 2026 to 2030 in terms of something that's then that rabbit that's going to come out of the bag. From where you sit, does that actually feel realistic, that there's going to be that 40, suddenly we're going to get to 2030 and we're going to have that uptake? And what would you actually need to see to have that change on the ground for that uptake to really scale now and into session 7? What do we need? I mean, we've been talking a lot about policy, but there are other things that we need that would actually help farmers move in that into more of that holistic direction that we're talking about.
Donna, if you nod or puff your cheeks, you're going to be the go-to person, unfortunately.
So the 45%, that feels, and well, I think Nim mentioned this, that feels like a very big jump to make in a relatively small amount of time, given that some of this it's not necessarily things you can just change overnight. So you need time and you need planning and you need to work in a cycle, and all the rest of it. So that feels, I don't think that's achievable. And we need to, I guess, there needs to be more about the kind of holistic thinking. So it's not necessarily just what people are doing on their land. There's also the infrastructure around that. So if we're trying to move to more low carbon, local food production, then there's other things that needs to happen. So obviously we're all aware there's a lot of talk about abattoir provision and everything else. And at the minute, it's concentrated in a few places and people can't access stuff like that locally. So that's then bringing in, food miles and all the rest of it. So there's something about, I don't think we're still just cracked the nut being able to look at the whole picture properly. And so we have a lot of policies that talk about, carbon reduction, but like food production, everything else, but they're not necessarily fully joined up yet. And there's sometimes unintended consequences. So if we take the beef calf scheme as an example, for instance, the government did make a decision and say, right, well, let's introduce the calving interval conditionality, set it at 410 days, and make them more efficient in terms of emission reductions. But it had unintended consequences for a lot of crofters and smaller producers, in that they then disengaged from the system and they sold their herds because the uncertainty over what was going to happen was too much. Then you lose the good stuff that they were doing through sensitive grazing and all the rest of it. Mm-hmm. So we need to be careful that decisions along the way to try and suddenly start jumping up these targets and hit your 45% don't have those knock-on unintended consequences. But that means a bit more joined up thinking now and allow people the time to start making the changes as they go.
Yeah.
I kind of made a list of things that I would like to ask in this regard. So I guess one is redistributive payment system. So we talk about that 70% to 30%. I think that's slid a bit if we went back and redid the maths. We need to cap payments but still make allowances for wages within that subsidy system. And also inclusion for smaller growers as well really needs to be in that. But we also need to really take into account that we have very different farming systems, and what will work on one farm will not work on the other. So what will support our, upland crofter with an incredibly sensitive, high nature value system is just as worthwhile in the climate and farming and food security context as someone on the East Coast with field upon field of tatties. Tatties.
Tatties, okay, great. Can I just ask also, do you have a sense that enough farmers already know what they need to do in terms of, we've legislated in the ARC Act for regenerative and sustainable farming. Do enough farmers actually know what that is and what they need to be doing, or does there need to be more support? I mean, we've got that Tier 4 which kind of specifies CPD, but does that actually really get to the point of us helping farmers actually understand what the new context is that they need to be working in? I think Nim, you indicated.
I mean, I can only speak for the members that are represented within SAP, and I think a lot of them feel the collective meh, because they are trying, and there's not and they're doing it off their own back a lot of the time, and so they want support and recognition of this, and not to be the outliers pushing against the system, essentially. And that's done through cooperation and collaboration and bold leadership. And I'm not saying cliff edges, but, maybe a hillock.
If I can jump in, I would say, in terms of what you could do, bring in those mitigation measures sooner, and then bring in targeted kind of training and CPD around those. Because I think, in short, some farmers absolutely know what they need to do, and are very familiar and completely to grips with it. But does everyone know? I don't think they do. Because I don't even think we really know, in terms of those measures, we don't really know which ones are going to work best for which farms and in which way. And there'll be new stuff that's emerging that actually has greater bang for its buck that is yet to be kind of properly understood as well. This might kind of sound a bit erroneous, but in terms of you saying bringing something in soon, and I was thinking of your earlier question around soil, something that could be brought in now is something around the soil testing and what happens to those soil tests. So you can think, oh, why aren't people doing more soil testing, and then what's happening with it? Because it's not just sort of doing it, is it? So you want something to happen with that and a whole journey to be gone on, by that farmer or crofter. So at the minute, that whole soil testing process is still manual and handwritten. So there's no soil carbon database. It's not being properly collated. It's going into a sort of bin, forgive me, but it is. So that means that, oh yes, Scotland is doing soil testing. But you're like, okay, fine, we're paying some farmers to test some soil. And then what? That there is no and then. So it's like that, and that's quite a practical thing, that you just like, right, let's make sure it's automated as an electronic form as of whenever, soon. And then we will use that to help us have a better understanding of what's happening with soil carbon throughout Scotland and help farmers make better use of those results.
I think there's we've talked about the cliff edge and the hillock now, it's been introduced, but do you think, it seems to me like also, Emma, you've kind of talked about just there that we're in a place where people who are working with the land farmers need to kind of try things out, and Nim's talked quite a bit about how we've got such a nuanced, diverse landscape and land and soils. Do we need something more to recognise that and encourage farmers to try things out, but if it fails, there's the support, there's the just transition. It's not really just transition, but some kind of support there that if you put some field over to try more integrated measures or whatever, or you try certain cover crops or something, and it doesn't really work, and you don't get a yield. Do we need to recognise that there's a time over the next 5 years where we need to try things out, and some of it's going to fail, and farmers need to be supported in that work?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you do. I think it's a really good point about, when the next election period will be, and then just before 2030, which will create hesitancy and uncertainty again. So, yeah, in an ideal world, you bring those mitigation measures forward, and you try and bring funding forward too, so that give at least a 2-year run up, because we all know if 2030 is when that's starting, it means you won't really see much happening for at least another 2 years from then. So let's use this period of time in a way that is not exposing farmers to risks that their businesses can't tolerate, but is allowing them to begin on the journey that we need to go on.
Just to add really quickly, so Nim mentioned about front-loading and capping payments, and I think that's got to be part of this, because particularly when you look at crofts and smaller family farms, you know, that they've got a bigger hurdle to get over to start to make. They don't have, you know, lots of capital behind them or whatever, so they've got larger barriers to make some transition happen. So we've just got to try some different stuff. Let's, you know, start moving it and see what happens.
No.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think also we set up a climate forum within the union last year for members to discuss all these things specifically. And the climate plan, we had a meeting on the climate plan in December actually. But we were talking about kind of carbon calculators and the assessments that our members are doing as part of the whole farm plan. But it kind of came out that understanding could be better in terms of what those outcomes could mean or how they could be implemented, but also that sometimes the suggestions weren't really suitable for their units, and that needs to be looked at as well in terms of how to make them more appropriate for our diverse sector.
Is that an automated suggestion? They put in information and then they get a whole host of suggestions that they could try?
Yeah, I think because it's based purely on your inputs, basically, then it can. I mean, my own carbon audit, my best suggestion was to put up some wind turbines, so that's not cutting my emissions, and it's also a huge capital expense, so it's totally impractical. So it's just that element.
And did you have a sense in your own kind of like work that you're doing in your farm, like what you actually think would be?
Well, mine's difficult because it's an extensive sheep farm on rough grazing ground, so it's as low input and basically as efficient as possible. So I knew that it was going to be challenging to find further emissions, but that's kind of, particularly for crofters, is the issue.
Yeah. Is it all right if I just come back quickly? I mean, so yeah, totally agree. I mean, I've spoken to many crofters who've tried the carbon audit. One lady that I spoke to, her recommendation was that she should just get rid of her cows. Yeah. That was the only improvement that it was offered. But the thing is, the people that are really interested in this stuff and really understand it all recognise that it's all input based. It doesn't do anything, capture anything about sequestration and whatever else. So immediately then people go, well, what's the point? Because it's not actually looking at the whole picture.
Okay, great, thanks. I'm going to ask you a question later about sequestration.
Hey, I've got a supplementary from Tim Eagle.
Yeah, it was just quickly, I mean, obviously we're talking about the climate change plan here, but I'm acutely conscious, obviously, greening is a big tier 2, there's quite a lot of money involved in that. So what's your thoughts, and I guess even around the whole farm plan, and actually I take on board what Ariane's just said then, the use of the documents that we're producing, actually, how much of a living document are they really? Because obviously that feeds into the sort of climate change and environmental future. And we had actually a bunch of young farmers in yesterday, and we were talking about this sort of stuff. And obviously, for example, Orkney, you know, greening isn't really ideal for an island like Orkney. But I guess my question is then, to what extent do you think the changes being made there help towards this future, or do you not think actually they're as flexible as they should be, if that makes sense?
Yeah, I think there's certainly a role to play, and again, this would be where our members feel like they are delivering, but it's to make sure that it's evidence-based and it's proportionate, and again, suitable for the kind of units that we see across the country.
Donna?
I think at the minute we would say that the greening measures that are coming forward are not applicable in a crofting context yet. We're waiting for something that's actually workable in a crofting context. So far, there's not been anything really come forward that does anything. So, unfortunately.
Thank you. Now going to move to a question from Beatrice Wishart.
Thanks, Convener. And livestock numbers, and there's been a lot of talk about reducing livestock numbers to reduce emissions, but the Scottish Government's been quite clear that it won't introduce a policy to reduce livestock numbers, but instead there's policies for efficiencies and welfare in livestock production. So can I ask what your view is in the measures in the draft CCP, are they sufficient to reduce livestock emissions?
Lorna?
Tricky one. Like I said, there is going to be emissions associated with that kind of production, but most of our country is only suited to livestock production, and its role in our culture, in rural Scotland more generally, is absolutely fundamental. So we are supportive of maintaining livestock numbers going forward. There are efficiencies that can be made, and we'll continue to work constructively to ensure that that's done properly through animal welfare measures and also efficiencies within the production system. But we absolutely want to see livestock in Scotland still being produced.
Yes, I guess I think, I do accept we're really good at growing grass in Scotland, but we need to also not get trapped into that idea that that's all we can do. There's a lot of our members that are doing quite innovative things in terms of mixed farming, and we have lost a lot of mixed farming over the last century, which was one of the most efficient systems we had. I guess it's the right livestock, right place. We've got some really fragile upland habitats, some really good species-rich areas that rely on cattle for grazing to maintain those. So it can't just be this kind of binary thing of nay cows, yay cows. And I guess my real concern is that if we kind of focus on this issue, we go down the intensification route by which we kind of focus on efficiency of the cow as a machine. And we are going to firstly drive a drift towards high input indoor systems potentially if we're not carefully managing this. So the policy that we set as Scottish Government should really prioritise public value, so biodiversity, soil health, over just number of cows per unit of land.
Okay, I had a meeting a few weeks ago with Food Standards Scotland. It was about children's diets and how the diets of young people and teenagers could be, sorry, young people. Can't call them teenagers now, can you? It could be improved by reducing the amount of red meat and dairy products, and from the briefing, greenhouse gas emissions from children's diets could be reduced by up to 28% by reducing meat and dairy, in line with recommendation from the Climate Change Committee. I'm not for 1 minute saying we shouldn't do anything about children's diets, but my point is I picked up on what Donna was saying earlier about muddled messaging. So it's an observation if anybody's got anything they want to come back on that observation.
Donna?
So I'm going to throw I think we need to look at where our meat comes from, because there's a whole lot of things at play here, isn't there? So our herd stocks are currently decreasing, but we're importing more and more cheap meat from elsewhere. Why are we doing that? Why don't we reduce cheap meat imports from elsewhere, introduce higher standards here, and use what we have? Surely that's got to come into play, rather than just saying, oh, well, we just need to cut our numbers to work around it. And, if livestock numbers were to be, at the minute, we agree with the policy to not reduce livestock numbers, but like I said, let's look at where the whole of our meat supply chain is coming from. But if we did get to a stage where we had to reduce numbers, then we've got to look at where we do that. So, let's try to protect the sort of well-managed, extensive grazing systems that are sustaining, your habitats and rural economies, and maybe look at the intensive things. So there's maybe targeted approaches that could be taken, and I guess one size doesn't fit all here. We're trying to, with the beef calving scheme, for instance, we're trying to compare emissions from, intensive livestock production, where stock's housed indoors and stuff like that, with the extensive, well-managed, high nature value kind of stuff. Those are not the same things, and the impacts when you start to mess with what people are trying to do there are completely different. So we've got to bear in mind that there are differences, and one size doesn't fit all, and we need to to factor that into any approaches that we take going forward. So it's a bit rambly, Beatrice, but you know what I'm saying? It's again, it's that bigger holistic picture that we need to look at, and taking one figure in isolation doesn't really work. But there are ways that we can achieve both. There are ways that we can possibly change the diet in schools, but not have to reduce our own herd numbers drastically. We could stop importing meat from elsewhere, you know, and still achieve probably more.
I should make it clear it was research that they were pointing me to that had been conducted by others, yeah.
I think you touch on some interesting points. I think we need to recognise that meat production in Scotland's done at a far smaller environmental footprint, if you like, than anywhere else. But I cannot get my head around why people are celebrating the fact that the Scottish Government are not bringing policies to reduce cattle numbers. What I think is disappointing is they're not bringing in policies to maintain, because the policies at the moment are seeing livestock numbers reduced, and we often hear about the critical mass. The next panel, there is a member of that panel who almost definitely argue for a dramatic reduction in livestock numbers. But we only look at one side of the equation. We don't look at the hugely important socio-economic benefit of cattle and sheep, particularly in the west of Scotland, the north of Scotland. And that can't be underplayed, or the sequestration or the fertiliser that livestock add. So should we not be looking at policies that actually maintain livestock numbers because of all the benefits that they bring, both climate, biodiversity and socio-economically? And we shouldn't really be celebrating the fact that the government are not bringing in a policy to reduce cattle numbers. Are we playing the game that Emma suggested early on? We're trying not to create too much friction. We're trying to look like we're all getting on. But if we're being pragmatic, honest and transparent, we need policies that are going to maintain livestock numbers. Nim?
I think we're kind of looking at it the wrong way. We're looking at the cow, and I think we need to be looking at the herdsman or person, and what system it is that these animals are being raised in, and what that is that, you know, when we're offering them public money for production of cow or livestock and meat or fibre, what it is that we're getting back in public goods from it. Not if we look at it only through the lens of food, and we're not even looking at the quality and nutritional value of that food, but just in terms of kiloage, then we're going to come away with some very, very perverse results in terms of this argument about livestock and where it's.
You're arguing from the point of looking at the high production quality, high animal welfare standards, high food value of meat products produced in Scotland compared to those that may be produced in the countries that will ultimately end up importing more from, to fulfil the demand that is still, it's not flatlining, the demand for meat is declining, but not at the rate that the CCC suggests we should reduce livestock production in Scotland.
The biggest, you know, climate change, so carbon, we take it in that metric, of food is the processing and moving it around, and then food waste at the other end. Not really, it is at the production, at the farming side, but we can't say we're producing that stuff and then ignore the rest of that supply chain. And when we've got a landscape like Scotland, then we need to fully invest in that supply chain working at all scales of agriculture in all of the different ecosystems that we have.
Okay, I've got a supplementary from Ariane and then Emma.
Thanks, Convener. Wanted to just come back to Donna. You said we need to look at where meat comes from and that we're importing cheap imports. So in a way, it strikes me that we've got a challenge there, though, right? We're trying to, within Scotland, reduce climate targets by 2045, carbon emission targets by 2045, yet we're kind of beholden to where that meat comes from in terms of supermarkets, I would say. So it's like we're trying to do things with farmers on the ground, but then there's, I guess, in a way, Nim, you started to talk about it, the supply chain and the way in which people can actually buy their food creates a kind of a limitation, a limiting factor on that. I mean, I went to visit Jock Gibson, who's a farmer in Murray who does mob grazing, really incredible. And the reason he can do that is because he's got the family butcher in the Forest High Street. And so what animals he raises on the farm, they end up in the local butcher and they feed the local people. But that's not happening if we're kind of beholden to a supermarket system where probably the majority of people in Scotland shop. So there's something there that maybe we don't have the powers to, the government doesn't have the powers to kind of deal with. The fact that the supermarkets are just going to keep on importing. We've got trading arrangements with likes of Australia bringing in sheep that have poor animal welfare and things like that. So there's a kind of a bigger challenge of how do you stem the flood of that and help people in Scotland actually start to eat locally produced food.
I think we talk about red meat a lot on livestock, and I think, Scottish Government needs to be aware of that there's certain things that they don't have, that they can influence, and we're not necessarily talking about influencing all the right things, but we can, put a little hand in the market here and there, and those local supply chains are the bit that are really crying out for investment at the moment. But I think the other thing is that, the way that we've inherited farming subsidy and public funding from a European context, you have hundreds of thousands of animals in Scotland that agricultural policy is not really having any influence over. So we're talking your sort of poultry people, and I look at people like Colin at Ramsdane Farm, who has incredibly genius pasture-fed broiler and egg production, but he doesn't receive any subsidy. So the stuff that we're talking about in ARP isn't really going to drive someone or reward someone for doing stuff that's useful like that, and is moving towards public money for public goods. So we need to have an ARP that steps away from the European context and actually looks at what works in a Scottish context and what meat means within that, and animal welfare and ecosystems that they live within means within that.
I've got a supplement with this. It's all tied in with this from Emma Roddick and then Emma Harper. So if Emma, if you ask your question.
Mine very much is tied in because it was the same comment from Donna that I wanted to pick up on there. Where I live, it is much faster for me to go out and buy frozen lamb from New Zealand than it is to buy lamb in the supermarkets. But when you look at DEFRA's statistics, lamb is one of the things that we produce more of than we eat in this country. So while trade is reserved to the UK, is there more that the Scottish Government could be doing through the climate change plan or other policy areas where we can encourage people to eat what we're producing? Because as you say, it doesn't really matter how that lamb is reared in New Zealand. It has travelled all the way across the globe, and that was not necessary.
So yeah, I agree. I don't know what the answer is to fix it, but it feels like there's a and you're right, Ariane. The supermarkets are there. People like cheap food. It helps them survive. Cost of living is challenging. All that sort of stuff. I really don't know what the answer is, but it feels like if we started to educate people and maybe there are some decisions the government can make. I mean, this is where I don't understand the trade laws and stuff, so forgive me for that. But there must be something that could be done that starts to encourage. And we've got our own, I guess, one place to start is looking at our public procurement system. We are in control of that. We could, with a Good Food Nation thing, drive, some activity that way. So that would be a start. And the supermarkets is a whole different ball game, but there are probably some actions we could take as a nation that start to encourage more use of local food rather than going elsewhere for it.
And that was exactly the point actually I was going to make earlier, but just going back to the schools question about what young people should be eating. Scottish Government can have an effect on public procurement. So what's in schools, what's in government buildings, what's in those contracts, we do have a control, and they are not always as rigorous as they should be, and they are often too geared on price. And we could say, let's support our farming industry with those contracts and make sure that it is Scottish beef, Scottish lamb, whatever. So, yeah, agreed. Supermarkets are trickier, but there are bits that we can affect more.
I'm going to bring in Emma Harper for a supplementary, the final one in this section.
Thank you. Thanks, Convener. It's been very interesting. It was to pick up on what Beatrice said about Food Standards Scotland and their latest dish survey. We scrutinised the climate change draft plan at Health Committee yesterday, and it came up about the fact that the research showed that people in Scotland already eat less than 70 grams of red meat a day. And the worry was that the Food Standards Scotland's information would be misinterpreted, and we're already thinking about if that was the case, there would be micronutrient deficit for people in Scotland. So because we're already eating that less meat, and we're trying to get more people to eat venison as well in Scotland, which is a red meat that is quite lean. And so I'm interested in, I guess, the issues around food miles and food miles, food production, all of the whole supply chain aspects of it, because I personally wouldn't want to see a reduction in our animals in Scotland when we can focus on meeting our dietary targets and with less food miles as part of it. So is that something we really need to, help make people more aware about? Because, because of the challenges that because it's about food supply and food production. It kind of links with Ariane's question about supermarkets as well.
Lorna?
I mean, I'm afraid I'm just going to repeat what we've already said, but it's just about a healthy, balanced diet, isn't it? This is all what we got taught when we were at school, and I don't think it's changed. So, yeah, no, we need to absolutely support that. And again, we want to see a thriving livestock agricultural industry where we are producing at home to the highest possible standards and feeding our schools and just general public from our own homegrown food. And I think that is important. And the demand isn't going to go away. So if we're not producing at home, we're only going to be importing it, and we're offshoring those emissions by doing so. So, yeah, I think it's just a wider conversation about healthy diets. But yes, absolutely, we want to be producing at home.
Okay. Move on to our next question from Tim Eagle.
Thank you. So it's a pretty similar question to the one about livestock, but it's just about fertiliser. So again, the climate change draft plan talks about reductions of emissions by reducing fertiliser usage. I guess the question then is, do you think the plan has enough information in it about how we can achieve that? And is there any additional things you think should have been in there?
I'd like to kick off on that. Lorna?
Yeah, on fertilisers, I think we kind of touched on it with soils. More information, obviously, and better understanding of the information that farmers get through their soil samples will help improve those efficiencies and ensure that we're putting the right stuff in the right place. It is about technological advancement, so it's a bit tricky because alternative and more efficient fertilisers, that's still being developed, so we don't really know what that's going to look like or how cost effective or economically viable that will be for businesses at the end of the day.
Anyone else? Donna?
Yeah, I mean, I guess in the Crofton context that there's not a lot of fertiliser use going on, so so I can't really comment in detail, but we've got other natural options too. I mean, in Crofton, seaweed is a very commonly used fertiliser and brings all sorts of goodness. So I think, again, we need to be careful that we don't go down too much of a technical route when actually there's probably some good good management practices that can achieve some of what needs to be done without sort of a load of artificial stuff.
Can I ask, there's almost inevitably a reduction in output when you reduce fertiliser input over the initial period. Maybe over 5-10 years, the production will come back due to improved soil health in a lot of circumstances. But ultimately, there will be a drop-off in outputs, which means a drop-off in income and potentially a drop in profits in the short term. Given that we've got a flatline budget, and we've seen the budget cut in real terms. Is it something that's actually going to be achievable over the short term, expecting farmers to reduce fertiliser without any support with the hit that they'll ultimately get when it comes to outputs? Lorna?
Yeah, I mean, it is challenging. I think, again, it is about business viability. So we're always thinking about what makes financial sense to ensure that these businesses survive and we can continue to produce. I think if you're doing your soil testing well, hopefully there isn't a huge drop-off in production. I appreciate there will probably be slightly. And yeah, again, it's where incentives really work best. And if we're looking at the wider framework about doing these actions around soil testing, carbon audits and things like that, it's making sure that they more fully show the more holistic view on the ground and what those impacts will be to ensure it's still viable where the businesses are still producing.
So given, again, we're going to have to write a report on the climate change plan as it is at the moment and ultimately vote on whether we adopt that climate change plan. Right now, in the draft plan, is there any indication of whether support would be there for farmers to reduce their emissions from fertiliser? So in that case, is it realistic? Should be in there at all? Or is it sort of pie in the sky, blue sky thinking? I suppose that's really where the question revolves. Is it realistic to expect a reduction in fertiliser use? Again, back to Lorna, just in your previous answer. Is it realistic? It's in the plan.
Well, yes. Is it realistic? Yeah, I think it can be more precisely spread, like I've already said, but the plan talks about, alternative and more efficient fertilisers. So again, that's about technology rather than necessarily reduction. So I think it is challenging, and like I say again, we need to be basing this off productive and viable businesses, and that's really the main point.
Nim?
I mean, I sit here as part of Nature Friendly Farming Network, and it is entirely possible. It's not easy, but the way that culturally it is at the moment, that 45%, we're not going to achieve that as an industry. And I think this is where we need to come back to resource efficiency rather than just maximum output, because we've done a lot of damage to some of our most productive farmlands in Scotland in, World War II, CAP policy over the last 100 years, and then going back to kind of Cheviot time. And, government is going to have to support people to undo that damage, but we're not talking about that or putting things in place at the moment. We're just tweaking around the margins.
Thank you. Emma Harper.
Thank you. Thanks, Convener. Just a quick supplementary question. We're talking about fertiliser. There is an opportunity for fertiliser that's natural digestate from anaerobic digestion processes. So basically, that would be about a whole circular economy for a dairy farm, for instance, to use their on-farm digestate. Is that something that needs to be pushed, researched, engaged with more?
I mean, I think we've answered it, and I'd imagine Lorna's done in the consultation in terms of full response. And yes, waste from that needs to be incorporated, but our farmlands can't be a dumping ground for waste because ecosystems can only absorb so much before it either volatilizes back into the atmosphere or runs off into our rivers. And so I think we need to be really careful about not thinking that, AD or something else is a technological panacea to managing these things, because if we push something, it becomes a perverse incentive and then we get the wrong thing out of it. So there's, the R&D around this is developing well, but we can't jump on it and say it's going to solve things.
Yeah, I don't mean food waste in anaerobic digestion. I mean like the digestate from slurry, for instance, which is already going on the fields, but it's another opportunity. So yeah, I'm not thinking about food waste on land.
I think I just classify all kind of digestate in that regards, because we apply it in a very similar way. So yeah, I think we just need to make sure that we don't, perversely incentivise it. I think it is definitely good to think about circular systems, but if you're not farming with resource efficiency in mind, then you're going to be producing too much waste, and there's only so much that you can then re-engage back into the land. And this is where that holistic viewpoint that SAP members really are trying to kind of get across here, which is you have to look at the whole farm context. And if you've got surplus of waste, something somewhere is out of balance.
Okay, thank you. Ariane.
Thanks, Convener. I need a little bit more understanding for this conversation. So it's not the question I was going to ask, but I would like to just get a sense from Nim. You've talked a number of times about resource efficiency, and at the very beginning of the session, I noted down that you'd mentioned in that context healthy livestock, local food. Could you just unpack what you mean by resource efficiency a bit more, just so that we can understand it, if that's possible? And then the question I was going to ask, and you can maybe touch on this because it follows on Emma Harper's opportunities around what could we use as fertiliser, is what Donna talked about, how crofters are using seaweed. And could that be something with the growing seaweed sector in Scotland? That seems to be something that's moving. Is that a possible opportunity for more natural fertilisers, or does that become too technical? Anyway, resource efficiency, what does that mean?
Yeah. Thanks. As a dyslexic, I really enjoy these. Can you define? So I guess if we define it only as output per unit, we risk funding intensification that actually damages nature. So I guess we're kind of asking the committee to consider that the plan defines efficiency as resource efficiency. So reducing inputs and building soil health. And that subsidies must support those kind of agroecological, not high capital techno fixes. Just to kind of continue business as usual, essentially. So resource efficiency, you were looking at some of the sort of developing R&D and concepts such as maximum sustainable output systems and other sort of nutrient loading and balancing systems. I don't know, it's hard for me to not just end up becoming a soil scientist again at you. So I'm going to back off.
Okay, so I guess I'll just have to go and research.
I'll send you out a bit on this afterwards.
That would be great.
So
yeah.
And share that with the committee.
Because it seems to me that that's quite an important part of the conversation that we need to unpack and understand more about. But what about the seaweed? Do we think that's a possible?
Lorna?
I think we have to be careful about what can be scaled up appropriately for the whole country. And also there's definitely other options. I mean, near my farm, which Beatrice will know, is a fish factory, and the waste from that is also incredibly good for fertilising ground. So yes, we need investment in that kind of R&D stuff to see what will work. But yeah, it needs to be scalable and appropriate.
Absolutely, thank you. On that point, we'll move on to the next question from Evelyn Tweed.
And thanks to the witnesses for all your answers so far, very instructive. The plan assumes that half of new agricultural machinery purchases could be alternatively fuelled by 2040. How realistic is this? And I can see people smiling, which is never a good sign. Donna, you smiled first.
Well, yeah, although I'm probably the wrong person to ask about this, because as I said earlier, for the sort of crofting context, machinery is not generally a thing. And to be honest, I mean, a lot of crofters will have, an old Massey that's been kicking around for years and years, and for them, economically, they're unlikely to invest in something brand new until they absolutely have to, because the financial side is just not at the same sort of level, and actually it probably makes more sense for them to keep fixing what they've got than replace new. So I'm probably not best to comment, but I think you have to think, I mean, the one thing I would say about alternative fuels and stuff is, then they need to be able to work in all contexts. So, taking something that's battery powered, for instance, over a common grazings where you're not guaranteed what the surface is going to be like underneath or whatever else might be a challenge in itself. And I know some crofters that have got battery-powered quads and have had issues, shall we say. So, but that's all I'll really say. I'll leave it to probably people who know far more about it than me.
Yeah, I think I would need to double check, but last time I was speaking about this, I think electric tractors, for example, are 2 to 3 times more expensive. That is significant. You're already buying a tractor, that's a massive capital investment, and then you're doubling or tripling that. That's really big. So it just needs to be viable and practical. And again, just thinking about what Donna's saying and the appropriateness, infrastructure and connectivity is a huge issue for most of our really rural members and producers in Scotland, so that would also need to be up to standard to allow it to work properly. And then again, oftentimes these options are much heavier, which has an impact on soil structure. So again, comes back to things that might cause more damage than we would intend to.
Yeah, I was going to add the bit about 2 to 3 times more costly, but also 2 to 3 times as heavier, and our soils really don't have that in them. But I think the other thing is that at the moment that agri-tech business is going to meet large arable on-farm, house livestock needs before they go out and replace it with the e-massey. And I think, we're not going to see a solution from that tech come in time as we're talking about climate emergency. And, yeah, there's a lot of infrastructure that needs to be put in place.
Again, back to this, we've got to decide whether the climate change plan, this is what we need to focus on, is whether it's fit for purpose. And, it does state that in 14 years' time, effectively 50% of new purchases for agriculture will be alternatively fuelled. Is that realistic? Where we're flatlining support, we're seeing a decline in support for the rural sector. Should it be in there at all? It's it's an assumption, and that assumption will be part of a whole heap of assumptions that will lead to us becoming net zero. If it's unrealistic, if you don't believe it's going to happen, it shouldn't be in there. Would that not be right, Lorna? If you don't believe it's happening, should we be reporting back and saying, in 14 years' time, to have half of all agricultural equipment being alternative fuelled, that's unrealistic. It ain't going to happen. You need to take it out of there, and we need to find our carbon reduction somewhere else.
Well, it's challenging. I think simply we don't know, because we don't know how fast it's going to develop. And we've seen a huge uptake in electric cars, for example, and that's been over quite a short period of time. But I don't know where the technology is, and I don't know how that's going to develop in 14 years. So it'd be difficult for me to say.
Okay. Move on to a question from Ariane Burgess.
Thanks, Convener. This is around trees and peatland on Farm and Croft. So Annex 3 counts sequestration in that wonderful acronym LULUCF, so land use, change and forestry, but not agriculture, despite delivery happening on farms. So thinking about peatland restoration and tree planting on Farm and Crofts, is this practice becoming normal mainstream activities, or do they still feel that they're marginal? And are there current support and advice? Is the current support and advice joined up enough? And what are the barriers that are still putting people off? So a couple of examples I'm aware of is one, there's a person who's trying to put pigs into the forest. I think he's called the Woolly Pig Farmer or something like that. And he's had a real challenge around being able to put pigs into the forest. He's trying to do that. Another example, I went to a tremendous monitor farm near Granton-on-Spey, where the farmer has been doing peatland restoration and also has a small forest where he's got his cattle grazing at times. But he says, well, I'm looking after the peat, but there's going to be no support for me and that kind of thing. So there's indication. I've seen people doing it, but struggling to actually get joined up support and funding. Any thoughts on that? Because that seems to be that's what we need to scale up, is because farmland is so much of our land, we need to get that integration, that holistic approach, I think, is what's been talked about.
So yeah, completely agree. Those activities need to be an integral part of agricultural reform and not viewed as sort of separate. And if we again go back to the principles of sort of sustainable regenerative agriculture, that does involve planting trees, restoring peatland. But at the minute, it still feels like they are thought about in silos rather than as part of the joined-up sort of thinking. I'm glad you said how to say that LULUCF. I was wondering, but I mean, there's obviously some talk about aligning there, but you know, we touched on earlier that whole farm plans are maybe not quite yet fit for purpose, and the carbon audits currently don't account for example, peatland restoration and woodland creation. And neither do they recognise yet where the land's been managed sensibly for climate and nature in the past already. So I think we've got to see some specific support for maintaining and restored peatlands, maintaining restored peatlands, the ones that are already working well, and other high nature value habitats that are in good condition. And again, when we look at the crofting context, this is where it's a little bit more complicated, and I know we were obviously the crofting bill was the discussions were yesterday, but you know, crofters are facing barriers at the minute when it comes to some of this work on common grazings because of crofting law. They have to get landlord consent, and but also issues with access to finance and administration. For instance, grazing committees aren't supposed to sit and hold lots of money, and you know, there's all sorts of stuff in there. So and there's uncertainties around private green finance and everything else. So we need to look at that side, because I mean, common grazing's land is, you know, 500,000 hectares of Scotland's landmass, so that's a big chunk of land there. But without some incentives and joined up thinking through agricultural support as well, I think uptake is likely to remain limited. And like I said, there are issues, and I'm happy to share with the committee some examples of where we're seeing crofters who are trying to do some of this stuff, but other barriers are preventing them from taking the work forward. So, yeah.
I can give you a nice practical example where, you know, we're talking about trying to increase hedgerows, things like this, and where the way that it gets implemented means that it's not flexible to deliver at the farm level. And so it takes really clever, persistent people to then get some of these things through these grant schemes. So Cora, who's one of my farmers, she runs an extensive sheep farm with a lot of restored peatland that she's done on a former open cast mine site. She had someone visit to look at putting hedgerows back in, but because they wouldn't permit gaps within the hedgerows, then within the planting scheme, she couldn't go ahead with it. If she went ahead with it and had a solid hedge, it would mean that she would have to top dress her sheep more because she didn't have wind going across the fields, which deters the insects. So she's had to choose not to go with a hedgerow in order to maintain her IPM that she's working towards. Pest management. Yeah.
I'm just trying to bust those jargons, but so that's fascinating. So I think that comes back to again what you've been talking about in terms of somebody wanting to do hedgerows can't have gaps, so on and so forth. Is that holistic looking at all of the integrated practices that could be working really well together to actually help us meet our climate targets. And emissions reductions, yeah. Thanks for that specific example. What about agroforestry? Is there any good incentives for that for farmers yet?
Right tree, right place, isn't it? And we always keep coming back to this, but it's, you know, it has to be that kind of flexibility to work at each level and each system and support that. And, you know, trees are a long-term investment.
And is there enough support in terms of funding and support to kind of think well about where to put the trees and that kind of thing?
Yes, but we also need to be really careful that it avoids and doesn't manipulate, you know, high nature value rough grazing in areas and cultural landscapes and like productive in byland as well. And just be careful of, you know, co-designing this and actually having flexibility, and also then making sure that any community benefit that's received from peatland restoration trees is actually felt at the community level. And so I do think we could do things like, you know, put in a sort of no harm to local community tests and things like that for some of the larger scale restoration stuff that's going on. But generally, yeah, it just needs to be more flexible.
Thank you. Thanks, convener.
Again, I'm going to come crux of it, and I want just a yes or a no answer. The plans suggest that we're going to see an increase of 19% in hedgerows and 2,600 hectares of agroforestry annually until 2025. 2045. Is that realistic in your view? Lorna?
Well, I'm not going to give you a yes or no, but I'm going to say that kind of what we've just talked about, it needs to be flexible. We need to have, farmers generally know their land very, very well. They need to have input on how that is managed, and they will deliver those results. But there needs to be, incentives and investment. And again, what we touched on right at the beginning, the carbon benefits from the peatland and the woodland and the hedgerows that we've just been talking about, that isn't accounted for anywhere, and that would help incentivise further action. As we've just talked about, it is a long-term investment, and it needs to be a holistic view about what works best on a particular unit. So yeah, that's really how we achieve it.
So the policies to deliver these outcomes by 2045 are not currently in place, and they need to be developed for that to be a pragmatic and...
Yeah, and the incentives to do that need to be there.
But they're not there at the moment.
Not, well, we don't know what the future we don't have enough information.
No, yeah, but what so if we're starting from today, and we've got to agree this plan in a couple of weeks' time, are the policies currently in place fit for purpose to grow hedgerows by 19% or see 2,600 hectares of agroforestry?
Well, I think we've just heard how difficult it is to do that for each farm. So it would be a challenge, but this should be coming from our future support framework, and that's where the policy would be.
Donna?
Yeah, I can't give you a yes or no. I suspect not. It sounds like a lot. I mean, and the thing is, I can't obviously really speak from the farm context, but I mean, a lot of crofts already are doing mixed land management, but I don't have a feel for the scaling.
Emma?
I'm afraid.
I'm going to go no. Yeah, I'm going to say no. And it really, not because that's evidence-based, so that's just kind of going with a gut feel of, you know, what we've seen so far to date. And I suppose, I think I would come back to that point. I think Lorna's completely right. It's like this area of activity, and, you know, going back to the point about peatland as well, it just isn't recognised. So farmers don't know why they would prioritise it. They know it's good, woolly good, nice thing. But beyond that, there isn't anything. Maybe there's a bit of funding, but it'll be a hassle to access it. It'll be complicated to implement it. There'll be issues. You have to really want to do it. And it just isn't recognised in a kind of landscape where they're already feeling penalised for things. So resolving that issue, whether it's through carbon audits or elsewhere, does need to be a priority.
Thank you. And briefly, Nim?
No, and my little bit of back of envelope calculation suggests that there's probably not even enough money in Tier 3 to deliver that up until 2030. So I don't think we've even got the financial infrastructure in place, let alone the cultural will for uptake.
Okay, thank you. I'm now going to ask Edward Mountain, who's here on behalf of the NZEC committee, to ask his questions. Edward.
Thank you, and convener. Just to avoid any dubiety, I just remind witnesses and members of the committee that I farm 1,000 acres, 500 acres, which is tenanted. I've got a 160 cow pedigree beef herd, and I mix farm using the principles of rotational farming as promoted by Turnip Townsend, which I'm sure all the panel will know about. So my concern, first question is, farmers are being pushed every day to get their carbon budget sorted out, work out, as are crofters, all the carbon that they're using, and the industry are saying it's all savings on their behalf. Do you think there's double counting in the plan? i.e. if you produce barley, it's got to be zero carbon, which the farmers will have produced and the industry will have said they will have decarbonised their whisky production to zero because somebody else has done all the work. Do you think that's accounted for in the plan? Lorna?
I'm not totally sure. I think I'd need to look at that example and go through it properly. But again, just to come back to what we've talked about, for farmers and crofters, they want that holistic view where the sequestration and is accounted for, so it's not just based on inputs, which is what carbon audits currently are.
Okay. Does any other panel member? Nim?
I just think from life cycle analysis that there probably is some crossover, but I would agree with Lorna that I also think there's some nuances of regenerative farming that just aren't being included in those life cycle analyses at all.
Okay, and Convener, my second question is if I could direct the panel members, you won't be surprised if you've heard previous evidence session, to Appendix 3 or Annex 3, page 67, where it talks of the agricultural pathway and tries to give some idea of what needs to be achieved. The problem is it says that there's no benefits that can be accrued or no costs worked out because the ARP has not been developed and it's not possible to develop it at this stage, and they're going to run forward the annual budget of farm subsidies to 2040, which clearly they haven't in the budget at the moment. So do you understand what, from this climate change plan, which to be a plan must be properly costed, what the costs will be to farmers and crofters from the proposals in the plan? It could be a yes or no answer, Lorna, if you'd like to give one. I'll go along the whole panel if you want to give me a yes or no answer. Lorna?
Well, no, we don't, because like we've talked about, the technologies are still in development and some of those are key policy drivers for emissions reduction, so we don't know yet.
Donna?
Yeah, I don't see how we possibly can, and also given that we still don't have a clear route map for how agricultural support is going to change and therefore know what might be covered in that and what might not be, I don't see how we could say at this stage that we do.
Emma? Nim?
Between the sort of blurry mess of regulation, subsidy grants, agricultural industry culture and tech horizon, no.
So I think in summary what you're saying is we have a plan without a route map of how to get to where we've got to be and we have no idea of the cost. Sounds like a good plan to me. Thanks, Convener.
Thank you very much, Edward. That brings us to the end of our questions this morning. So thank you very much for joining us. Your contribution has been hugely helpful and help us inform our report, which will then subsequently report back to Edward's NZEC committee. I'm now going to suspend the meeting until 11 a.m. to allow for a changeover of witnesses. A suspended meeting. Welcome back. We'll now continue with our scrutiny of the draft climate change plan by hearing from a panel of academics and NGOs. And I welcome to the meeting in person, we've got Dr Vera Elroy, the climate change researcher from Scotland's Rural Colleges, Claire Daly, the Head of Policy and Advocacy from WWF, and joining us remotely this morning, we've got Dave Mackay, the Vice Convener of Link's Food and Farming Group, and Professor Dave Ray, who's the Chair in Carbon Management Education at the University of Edinburgh. Once again, before we move to the question, just remind members and witnesses, we've got till about 12:15, 12:30, so to try and keep questions and answers as succinct as possible. And you will not have to operate your microphones. Our sound engineer will do that for you. So I'll get kicked off. In the last panel, we were trying to find out whether those having to deliver emissions reductions on the ground, whether the proposed plan was credible and whether it could be delivered. So the same sort of question to this panel is, how credible is the Scottish Government's proposed emissions pathway for agriculture, and will it meet future carbon budgets? And if you don't believe so, is there anything missing from the plan that you expected to see? Who'd like to kick off? Vera.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the committee for inviting me for this really important meeting. I'm very happy that I can share the views what I formed based on science and over the past decades in Scotland and abroad. As I was introduced, I'm with SRUC, but I represent my own scientific views at this meeting. And a short answer, just a few points to your question, and I'm sure that we will go into the details later, is that I feel that the plan is not credible to deliver the emission reductions, and it's not necessarily supporting or acting in the right way across the industry and land use and the food system. And why I feel so is a few points for now, and we can go into those later, and I'm sure that the others have views on that too. First of all, the emission pathway in the draft climate change plan is a lot higher than was advised by the Committee on Climate Change in the 7th Carbon Budget for Scotland earlier in 2025, quite substantially higher for every 5-year period. That means that it leaves agriculture with high emissions, which one can say that, okay, so that's better, because if we have a weaker agriculture policy plan, then surely it can't reduce emissions that much. But that it really means that it's a huge delivery risk for the overall budget in Scotland and to reach net zero emissions by 2045. The emission reduction was also backloaded in the current agricultural CCC plan. Most of the mitigation pushed back to the end of the period. It depends on research and acceptance of quite a few further mitigation measures, and have a lot of efficiency saving measures which can increase emissions actually, because it can increase production and consumption if livestock numbers, especially livestock numbers, but other production is not kept in a way or kept in bay. And what I find the major problem with the plan is that it's based, the sole policy instrument, the major policy instrument, is based on voluntary uptake supported by subsidies. Now we know from economic literature and policy literature across sectors that subsidies are not sufficient. Subsidies to be sufficient need to be extremely high, which means they would be financially unsustainable. So this voluntary uptake based on subsidies policy is very, very weak, and that jeopardizes even the plan which the CCC contains. Thank you.
Thank you. I know we're not here to talk about the budget, but I think we can't ignore the fact that yesterday we heard that in real terms the rural support budget is falling and has done over a number of years. Does that make this draft plan even more unrealistic, given that the additional support that you've stated that might be needed in the form of subsidies or encouragement, there's going to be less money? So is it even less credible on the announcement in the budget yesterday?
I would say so, yes, especially if we really go ahead with subsidies only. And of course, because the rural support is trying to do so many things across agriculture and rural areas, income support in a way, biodiversity, water pollution, and so on, adaptation, reducing flooding, and so on. So I would say yes. However, I would also urge everyone, especially MSPs and NGOs, to consider a push away from the subsidy system for reducing greenhouse gases and into a pricing system, which will also help to some extent the budgetary problem.
Thank you. I'm going to move to Dave Ray and then Dave Mackay.
Thanks, Convener, and thanks for having along to the committee. I'd echo Vera. I mean, it's not a credible pathway or plan at the moment. I mean, key to it is, Vera's covered the key elements. I guess the policies it's relying on, we don't know. So rural support plan, we don't know what that looks like. So it's really hard to say this is how the kind of aimed emission reductions are going to be achieved, certainly over the next 5 years for the first rural support plan. And as your panel before the break picked up, that 45% assumption in terms of uptake of measures, I mean, that, you know, that's incredible in terms of seeing that kind of change in uptake over that period through to up to 2030. And certainly without a rural support plan and without the kind of the actual policies and budget in place, it's really, really hard to see, even with the limited emission reductions for our sector compared to other sectors in the climate change plan, how that's going to be delivered. So no would be the answer, Convener.
Thank you. David Mackay.
Yeah, thanks, Convener. I agree with what's been said so far. And I think if we look back historically, the last 33 years from 1990 to 2023, there's been a 13% reduction in agricultural emissions, and that's largely been driven by reductions in livestock numbers. So that has happened despite government policy rather than because of it, you could argue. The draft pathway now has us up to 2040 going further, so a 23% cut over a 17-year period. So there is a need to go much further and faster than we are currently doing. And the concern that Scottish Environment Link has primarily about this is the reliance on the agricultural reform programme. And you've talked about this in your earlier session today, but we are concerned that the current pace and scale of change within that programme is not sufficient to meet the targets that have been set. And Convener, you mentioned the budget. I think realistically, whilst we would all like to see a larger agricultural budget, the reality is that public finances are under pressure. So our expectation is that there is unlikely to be any increase in the overall budget. Therefore, we need to use the money that is there more effectively than we're currently doing. And as you heard this morning, we still are largely tweaking legacy cap schemes. And it's difficult to see at the moment with the schemes that have been set out how those emissions reductions are going to be delivered. And I think, as Dave says, a lot is now riding on that rural support plan, as well as the future development of policy in order to get us to where we want to be.
Thank you. And Claire.
Thank you, Convener. Yes, similar to how some of the other speakers have mentioned, we do not, despite identifying non-road machinery and fertiliser in key areas, there's really very little detail in the draft climate change plan on what the Scottish Government is going to do to deliver this. There is lack of detail linked to specific targets. The climate change plan also fails to account, as Vera would have said, it fails to account for the largest source of emissions from Scottish agriculture, which is deriving from livestock management and livestock numbers. And I know we'll come on to that. Just one other thing to add to what the other speakers have said. Despite the mention of food production in the plan, it fails to consider how the climate change plan could, for example, complement other policies and how policies could be mainstreamed together to reduce emissions. And lastly, the climate change plan, as we see it, has some mention, but very little of the important role that an ACUS could have for Scotland. This is something in the earlier session, it came up again and again, the point about knowledge and sharing knowledge.
Okay. Just there's the last little bit of the question, and if you don't think there's anything missing, or don't volunteer to speak, but I suppose the question is, you saw this, the CCC recommendations, and then we saw we see the draft climate change plan from the Scottish Government. Was there anything that you expected to see in that plan that's missing?
Yes, well, we would have expected a better alignment with what the Climate Change Committee had recommended, and looking towards, for example, signposting to the Scottish dietary goals could have been a way forward, and that would also generate public health benefits. Again, something that was referred to in the earlier session. That's not there.
Anyone else like to come in and what they immediately, Dave?
Thank you. Yes. So, I mean, the Climate Change Committee, in their advice to Scottish Government, were really clear. It feels like Groundhog Day, this, to be honest, Convener, but they asked for clarity in terms of the assumptions, in terms of how emission reductions were estimated and costings around that. Edward Mountain, I think, in his committee talked, show you're working, I think, was the phrase he used in terms of for other sectors. And Richard Dixon, actually, giving evidence to his committee, really summed that up really well, just in terms of the crucial facet, which is like where the numbers come from, but also the sensitivities around those, so where the big kind of emission reductions are going to come from, and if they don't happen, what the plan B is. And one of the things, looking at the climate change plan across the piece, and I must, I'll put on the record, there are some really good parts to the climate change plan, particularly around just transition, which hopefully we'll get into. But one of the key things which is missing across all the sectors is that granularity and being able to see where the assumptions, what assumptions have been made at that kind of sub-sectoral level, and what the sensitivities are, and the plan Bs if things aren't realised. So I kind of think for our sector in terms of agriculture, we've got this situation where we've got even less clarity on that than most sectors. And we're in that position of poor progress, as David said, historically, and a real risk that in another 10 years' time, we're sat here saying, well, we didn't realise those emission reductions either, and agriculture is standing out like a sore thumb compared to the other sectors and is more vulnerable as a result in terms of climate action. So yeah, I'm a bit frustrated, but for me, it is showing you're working really is lacking, and I was hoping to see that.
Do you think one of the reasons we haven't seen the working is, and it was picked up by Emma Patterson-Taylor from SEOS in the previous panel, that the government are reluctant at this stage to make unpopular decisions, because it would appear that there's a lack of pragmatism and honesty over this, because we've seen recommendations about livestock productions, and many people find it unpalatable. But do you think that the draft plan is not bold enough because the government don't want to make what would potentially be unpopular decisions at this stage in the electoral cycle?
Well, only they can answer that, truthfully, I guess. I think that would be a likely part of the context, just because this is difficult. Our sector, it's hard to decarbonise. We need this big transformation in agriculture, like all the other sectors have to transform. And I think politically it is difficult, and they hear from us all the time shouting at them about go faster or go slower, or I think, as you picked up in the previous panel, we've got, I think, in Scotland a really good kind of approach from government and parliament in terms of listening to the stakeholders, which is not just the industry but the wider rural community. But when we've got a climate and nature emergency, we need government really to lead. So they need to listen, they need to be well informed, but then they need to take the hard choices and upset people. And I think at the moment we're probably seeing something which speaks more to keeping people happy rather than, for now, rather than addressing what is a systemic challenge for the future.
Okay. Anybody else like to respond to that? Vera?
To your original question, Commissioner, please, about what I see as missing, is also that not one sector can be considered in the climate change plan or any similar plans on its own, because the net zero depends on every contribution. Now, the CCP left agriculture with higher residual emissions, and if you look at the overall numbers between sectors and how they differ from the Climate Change Committee's recommendation, is that you can find out that what the CCP is doing or hoping to do is to save or generate massive, probably very over-optimistic emission savings, both in engineered removals and land-based removals, and also in the energy sector, that in total in the last 5 years, 2036 to 40, that the CCP plans to generate 12 gigatons removals, and the CCC's advice in May on the same sectors would be 4 megatons emission. Sorry, it's all megatons, not gigatons. 4 megatons emissions. So not only the scale is different, but the CCP is hoping to get minus 12, while the CCC suggested what's possible is plus 4. And if that doesn't work out, then the residual emissions in agriculture, which are planned to be still very, very high, will count even more and jeopardize all the plan. And it links with the link of contingency plan, which also the CCC pointed out in a specific letter to the Scottish Government, the need for a contingency plan and the need for milestones and flag points to basically checkpoints where they would get to a contingency plan, and that is missing. That was missing in the previous CCP. If we had that, and if we had proper retrospective assessment, we would be already on the contingency route.
Okay, thank you. I've got Dave Mackay and then a supplement from Alistair Allen.
Thanks, Convener. I think our frustration on this stems from the fact that the Scottish Government declared a climate emergency in 2019, and after that we had numerous reports, including the Farming for 1.5 inquiry, one that WWF did in 2020, which set out pretty clearly what the options were in terms of reducing emissions from agriculture. And, it was things like reducing nitrogen fertiliser use, getting more lagoons into grassland, looking at animal health and animal feed additives, agroforestry, organic farming. So, these things, we know that there's emissions reductions that can be delivered by all of these, but the current policies that Scottish Government has aren't incentivising or rewarding much of that. So, for example, in February 2023, there was a publication of a list of measures that were under consideration for Tier 2 of the new 4-tier framework, and within that list there was lots of those types of measures that I've just flagged that would have allowed some of the things that previously would have been under competitive agri-environment schemes to be more mainstreamed into agricultural support. But that hasn't been brought forward. So, there's clear kind of low-hanging fruit here that we could be doing, or policy could be incentivising or encouraging that we're not. And, just to use the nitrogen fertiliser example, if you look at the nitrogen use efficiency statistics that are published annually by Scottish Government, you can see very clearly that whilst we're making progress in the arable sector with about 65% nitrogen use efficiency, livestock, it's 10%. And the lower the figure, by the way, the worse that it is. So what that means is we're wasting lots of nitrogen on grass. So that's a big opportunity to try and make up some of these emissions reductions that we need to. But at the moment, some people are doing that, but we're not incentivising that or rewarding that through policy as things stand. We're still essentially giving the same amounts of money to the same people to do broadly the same things each year.
Thank you. Alice, do you want to ask your supplementary, then move on to your substantive question? Thanks.
Okay, thank you. I'll ask this in a deliberately provocative manner, so forgive me for that. But a couple you have mentioned there about your assessment, and I appreciate it's a considered assessment about Scotland not going far enough. And you seem to be talking about Climate Change Committee's recommendations around livestock. So my question would be, you've suggested that this is because it's difficult or unpopular, and that may be the case, I don't know. But is there not another question in here, which is that if Scotland were uncritically to take the advice about livestock, what would places like the one I live in and represent do agriculturally? What would happen if livestock levels fell beyond a critical mass to a point where communities couldn't actually operate agriculturally? What would happen in those situations if the landscape changed radically because it wasn't grazed and there wasn't habitat for bird species and so on? And what would happen if we did all that at the same time as we kept eating meat, except we just bought it from the other side of the world?
Can I ask you to reserve your response to that, because Beatrice Wisher's got a stamped question around the livestock, but it's very pertinent to the whole argument. But if you could come in with your substantive question, I know Beatrice has got a question on that topic as well.
Well, I suppose it's in that case my main question would really be about. I suppose you've covered some of these issues, but I mean, what scale or type of policy is it that you would like to see from agricultural reform programmes to have confidence in the emissions trajectory? I suppose that's a more positive way than the kind of provocative way I put it in my supplementary, which I understand that we'll come to. But what is it that you would like to see in terms of the way we changed agriculture in order to get to the aims you are talking about?
Vera?
Thank you very much, and thank you for the question and for the next one, which we will discuss as well. Really important, both. In terms of policy, from what I've seen and read and discussed with economists and other scientists working in various sectors in climate change and in general environment, is that subsidy-based, voluntary-based policies work to some extent. They are specifically important in the beginning of a policy cycle to increase acceptance, to kick off R&D, to support transition. But eventually, what works on the long term, both financially and adjustability, is pricing policies. That's specifically either taxing or some form of emission trading scheme. Taxing is going to be introduced for agriculture in Denmark. Emission trading scheme, we have various experiences with that in some sectors, and there can be adjusted to agriculture. They would need to be adjusted. It's not so straightforward to bring in. But pricing policies bring in revenues, which then can be redistributed to further improve the transition and also to help those who will need to go through the harder transitions. Thank you.
Thank you, Convener. In terms of what change we would like to see, I'm just following on from David Mackay's, a little bit more detail on David Mackay's point that he made earlier. And speaking to that point of show us your homework, back in 2020, WWF did a report written by Nick Lampkin, delivering on net zero. And what's really good about the report, and I'm not going to repeat, David has already talked through some of the measures, but all of those measures were quantified in terms of the amount of emissions reductions they would achieve and costed. It's all there in spreadsheets, in tables for you to look at. They are, of course, because it was put out in 2020 prices. But many of these measures can be put in place. And again, referring to the report that we did with the Soil Association, if you look at the table of measures that could be brought into the basic payment system, that has the potential to be transformational. That would be one thing that we would like to see. The other thing, just recently in November, we had a report, WWF had a report on skills for farming. That was something that I noticed came up very much, quite consistently earlier in the session with industry. A lot of the knowledge is there on how to make changes. It's just, it isn't funded. And if I could be so bold as to, again, in the report, we have a number of international comparisons, and you'll hear my Irish accent, so I will be so bold as to make a comparison. But it is interesting to see that in Scotland, our ACIS and agricultural advice is funded to the tune of just under 6 million a year. In the Republic of Ireland, it's 150 million euro a year, which is about 130 million pounds based on current exchange rates. And of course, the industry is bigger and more intensive, but it is not 20 times the size of the Scottish industry. It's about kind of 2.5 times the size, but there is 20 times the advice. There are some very innovative schemes happening there. And of course, there's many aspects of Irish agriculture that I'm not going to hold up as a model of best environmental practice. But I think in that thing, the advice and, having visited some of the farms through Pasture for Life and the Nature Friendly Farming Network, there is loads of innovation happening. It's just giving farmers the mechanisms and the funding to share that knowledge.
Dave Ray.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, Claire summed up really well, actually, kind of, I guess, where the yawning gaps are, because a lot of this stuff we know. So the WWF report in 2020, I'd certainly recommend that if you haven't looked at it. It's a really nice piece of work, and it's still relevant today. The Farming 1.5 report, I'd also, I'm biased because I was part of that, but I think it gave a really good view of what is practicable and what emission reductions are possible. And we look at David Mackay mentioned the list of options that are available, that have been well researched and well discussed in terms of the stakeholders, the people who would implement them. But there isn't the incentive to do it, and there isn't that context to actually see them being rolled out. And this is my frustration, I guess, is that some of the component parts to make this happen are there. So the whole farm plan you talked about a bit in the previous panel, I love the concept of the whole farm plan, because what it should mean is that we can better understand, for instance, the carbon content of our soils on our farms, the biodiversity package I really like. So Nature's got a really nice platform, if anyone's tried using that for their farm, where you can actually understand better the species and the habitats on your farm. But it's all just information, that it doesn't lead to any action. And this point was made, I think, before the break, is without the kind of follow-up, then it's just words or pretty pictures, and it doesn't actually mean emission reductions or nature protection. So that's what we're lacking, is actually implementation of what is now a decade of work on this in terms of what solutions are practicable and should be applied to meet those emission reductions and nature targets.
Thank you. David Mackay.
Thanks, Matt. I agree with everything that Dave and Claire just said, so I won't repeat that. But Link, for quite a long time now, has been making the case, and I referred to this earlier about the budget, about moving the money through the tiers. So what that means is more money coming out of Tier 1 direct and into Tiers 2, 3 and 4, and 4 including that advice piece that has just been discussed. The rationale for that is that at the moment, I mentioned earlier that the budget's not getting any bigger as much as we would like it to. We need to be doing more with it. So it doesn't necessarily mean that individual farms would be receiving less. We would be asking them to do more or do other things in order to receive those payments. And if you look at the Scottish Government's own analysis, so at the time that the Agriculture and Rural Communities Bill was introduced, there was analysis published of cap payments, and it found that direct payments were ineffective in terms of delivering on environmental outcomes. The Agri-Environment and Climate Scheme was the only scheme that was found to have a positive impact on climate and the environment. But the budget for AICS in 2015 was £55 million. This current year, it was £28 million. So the bit of the current structure that is actually doing this stuff, we're underfunding it. And that's not even accounting for inflation over the past 10 years. And I think it's also worth pointing out that Link's position on this has been supported by the First Minister's Environment Council. There's a publication, I think, just before Christmas, where they've said that the distribution of funds needs to change and more money needs to go into those higher tiers. And the Scottish Government Academic Advisory Group has also agreed that there needs to be better targeting of agricultural support payments in order to achieve these environmental benefits. So it's not just Link that is saying this, it's been backed up by many others as well.
Okay, thank you. Tim Eagle.
Can I just ask a quick supplementary question there, David? So, because I've never really understood why, because my understanding was there was a whole package. In fact, I'm sure I saw it on an Excel spreadsheet, a whole package of measures that I think would have helped, but they were never implemented. And in fact, greening now has gone a completely different direction. Do you know why they weren't implemented? Because obviously there was talk around the IT system, but if the block has been that, I don't know if you know that, but I'd just be curious to know why what came out has never actually transpired into reality on the ground.
Yeah, I think so. We've discussed this, I think, at previous committee sessions last year. The list of measures, you can still see it was published in February 2023, and if not, we can share with the committee. We were very positive about that as Link, and we thought that was a really good step forward. Our understanding of the reasons for that not being brought forward was partly due to IT challenges, that the current infrastructure wasn't really set up to deliver anything different than getting money out the door for BPS and greening, etc. But there may also be, I guess, a desire not to upset some of the other stakeholders. And I think you discussed some of that this morning, but I don't know, and I think you'd have to ask the Minister about that.
But do you accept, just one quick thing, because I see this as actually quite an important point, because actually if we are all saying actually we are happy to move in the right direction, and then there is some confusion about whether it's because, as we heard in the first panel, that a relationship is too close between a couple of different groups, or if it's the IT, it's important to work out politically, I think, what actually is the stumbling block here. Is it will, or is it ability, through the IT system? And I guess then, do you accept then that that is quite an important distinction, working out so that we can push in the right direction?
Absolutely, and as I said, we would be very supportive, and we were very supportive of that list of measures coming through into policy, and we still think that it should. And I don't see any reason, if there are IT challenges, why they cannot be overcome.
Yeah.
And if the political will is there, then we should be able to do that.
Thank you.
With apologies to Alistair Allen, we're now going to move on to the substantive question about one of the most contentious issues in livestock reductions. Beatrice Wishart.
Thanks, Convener. And if the panel could respond to Alistair's very pertinent question, it would be helpful. I mean, my question is phrased in a way that, what would happen if the Scottish Government doesn't introduce policies to reduce livestock numbers? What's the alternatives to close the gap? And are those alternatives within or without or out with the agriculture sector?
Who'd like to kick off on that one? Dave?
Thank you. Yeah, it's such a good question, as was Alistair's, obviously related to it. And I think, obviously there was a political decision by the Scottish Government not to take the CCC's kind of balanced pathway in terms of livestock. And I get that. That's part of their job. I think one question I had over that is, what if livestock numbers go up? What's the contingency? So this goes back to that. We've got high beef prices at the moment, for instance. If they continued, you could see a growth. But it's really about, I guess, we've got this long-term vision for Scottish agriculture, and livestock has to be part of that. And as you say, Alistair, you know, a lot of our communities, including my own, you know, we rely heavily on livestock. You know, it's core to what we do. But we've seen that the herd numbers decrease over a long period now. I think if we've got that situation of them continuing to decrease, which is potentially the likely direction, what we have to see is to avoid that cliff edge or hillock or whatever that was talked about earlier, in terms of I guess the numbers getting so low in some areas that you lose the infrastructure around the livestock sector, and this comes back, I guess, to the fact that I think we're storing up real risks for the sector in the future by not seeing action now. So it's business as usual, pretty much, in terms of the climate change plan, the agri part of it. But what that means is we are the sore thumb in terms of a sector, in terms of emissions. Livestock is a big part of our emissions, completely understand that. And then we get this potential future with carbon border adjustment mechanisms, etc., where we're put under real pressure in 10 years' time, if not sooner, because we haven't had a planned and delivered reduction in emissions. And that could be through a livestock sector where we get improved health. We have, you know, the calving intervals obviously are being addressed to a certain extent. Methane in terms of feed additives having the potential to come in and do some heavy lifting as well. But it needs to be something where we don't kick the can down the road. We certainly can't afford it for livestock because it's so fundamental for our rural community. So I think it's a case in point for this part of the climate change plan, lacking the detail, the rural support plan, as an example, that we need to reassure livestock farmers and the communities that rely on livestock around Scotland that this is the direction of travel and this is kind of what is expected over time. I really think that fear of cliff edge and that fear of what policy might come in a different parliament under a different government around livestock, it's just bad for everyone. So yeah, it really is, like I say, it speaks to the key issue I've got with the current policies, is that we haven't got the detail, and that includes livestock.
David Mackay.
Yes, so I think it's a really good question, and Environment Link agrees that, you know, particularly grazing ruminant livestock are absolutely vital to sustainable food production in many parts of the country. And in fact, we put forward proposals to government for a high nature value farming scheme, which by our calculations, there's around 40% of Scotland's agricultural area, you know, primarily in the north and west, but also in other upland areas that could be considered to fit into that high nature value where grazing livestock are delivering, you know, biodiversity, ecosystem benefits. We're a bit confused. I think there's some inconsistencies when you read through all the documents in the climate change plan. So you've got the high level commitment that's been mentioned that Scottish Government won't introduce any policies to reduce livestock numbers. But at the same time, in Annex 3, it makes clear that the baseline for emissions reduction projections assumes a continued downward trend in livestock numbers. So on the one hand, government is saying that they're not going to have any proactive policies to reduce livestock, but on the other hand, there seems to be an acceptance that the current and historic trends are going to continue in the future. So from our point of view, it's better to be upfront about that and actually start thinking about, okay, if there is going to be that transition, then what does that look like and how do we manage that? And at the moment, we're not seeing enough of that detail, as David said.
Thank you. Vera?
Thank you very much. First, answering the governance question about what would happen if we don't do anything about livestock numbers. And the historic trajectory is downwards. There is no guarantee that it continues to go down for two reasons. That one of this, especially the recent reduction in beef cow numbers is the strengthening of the dairy beef coming into the supply chain, the food supply chain. That meaning less beef cows are needed, but that is now reached the limit. So almost all of the dairy farms are producing dairy beef from the surplus calves. So that means that we are kind of at the end point of that reduction. Of course, dairy yields are going to continue to increase, but that will shrink the dairy herd a bit, but that might have to be then picked up by the suckler herd if it goes that way, if it's uncontrolled. So I can't see a guarantee that the total livestock herd, cattle, sheep, will continue to reduce, and their consumption, total consumption of barley and grass and so on, is not decreasing as much as the numbers because the efficiencies and the productivity is increasing. So the fewer animals, but still consuming quite a lot and still lots of fertilizer going into the whole system and so on. So what happens is that very much we won't be able to reduce numbers, agriculture emission numbers much. Then the only way to counter, then the technical options can help, heavy lifting by feed additives, which are all in debate. What we can get maximum is maybe minus 20% or 25% at the farm level technologies if we force those through or subsidize those through, but the remaining emissions will be there. Now, what happens in 2045 or even before is that someone somehow magically have to put into millions or billions of pounds into carbon capture. Also, the land-based carbon capture, land-based sequestration is temporary. We tend to forget that it's not permanent, like direct air capture. And it's temporary because one can blow up the land, the forest can fall, or climate change can change that much that the forest dies out. So I think what happens is really likely, increasingly likely, that we miss the target. Now, what happens then, it's down to society and Parliament and others to sort out. But I see a crash point coming if we don't do something in agriculture. And to address Mr. Allen's question is that I can't, of course, address it in just a few sentences, but the importance is the managed transition over time and avoiding the cliff edge and pointing out alternatives. Not everyone will have an alternative, and not everyone will have to leave livestock production. Livestock production is needed. It will be still part of it, maybe less. But alternatives are needed in terms of land use as well, because we will need to produce more biomass. There is the circular economy plan. There is the biomass production and biochar production, which go into feed into the CCP itself. So there are a lot of other demand for land use, which to some extent generate profit. And how to balance this and how to make sure that certain communities where there is high nature value, large areas of Scotland, or where the rural communities really depend on these type of activities are safeguarded, that's down to the details which are missing. Thank you.
Okay. Claire, did you have any comments?
I think a lot of it has been covered by the other speakers, but just coming back to the simple question and the not so simple answer to the simple question, you know, what would happen if we don't introduce measures to reduce livestock numbers? Just based on the profile currently of emissions that do come from livestock management and livestock numbers, it's nearly half of agricultural emissions, and manure management another 14%. If we don't, you know, that is what, from a carbon emissions point, or sorry, a greenhouse gas emissions point of view, will happen, that we will not achieve the targets. But I should say it's very important to say that, you know, we in WWF recognise that livestock can support nature recovery, including rewilding approaches, and there's a very strong place for high welfare, low input a livestock sector in the UK and in Scotland. You know, Scotland is renowned for producing some of the world's best reared meat and operating as part of regenerative farming systems. You know, so again, linking to what Vera has been talking about, avoiding the cliff edge, and it was spoken about earlier in the earlier session. not just suddenly cutting numbers, but phasing in a different way. And if I could come back to that 2020 report on delivering a net zero in agriculture, there are many suggestions, there are many proposals and policy solutions in that could be implemented. But, you know, it's very important, as I say, that, you know, we recognise the important role that, you know, mixed arable or mixed livestock can deliver for a whole range of services to nature and to climate.
I've got a few supplementaries in this. I don't know who's best set to answer this, but if we don't have a reduction in the demand for meat products that aligns with the reduction in livestock numbers, are we not actually at risk of seeing a net increase in emissions, because we're actually then looking at the supply chain that involves cargo ships or air freight to bring meat products in from other parts of the world with a far higher carbon footprint, not just in shipping them, but also in the production compared to what we have in Scotland. How do we address that? Vera?
Yes, thank you very much. So this is why it is extremely important to to consider production and consumption together and develop policies for both of them together. And we are lucky because most of the health goals align very well with the GHG goals on the consumption side. But we need to recognise that we need to start with progressively strengthening policy mix on the consumption side as well. That I won't go into the details, but there is a good literature on suggesting how to get the acceptance first and then modify the purchase behaviours. And we have examples of that in the UK and elsewhere of various health taxes on, for example, on products and food products. So that is really important. What is also being done, of course, for example, look at the ETS in Europe, and it's not easy, but carbon border adjustments can be another way of reducing this leakage, which is caused by not decreasing the demand at home, but in decreasing the production. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to bring in Dave Ray briefly on this and then move to supplementary from Ariane Burgess and Emma Roddick. Dave.
Yeah, just very briefly, just in terms of that, I think that carbon footprint or emissions footprint thing is really important in terms of offshoring. So food miles is almost irrelevant in terms of meat, unless you're private jet flying in your steak from the other side of the world. It's really the production which counts, and our production is low emission relative to most of the world. So that's really important. I think if we are in that situation where we're importing more meat and dairy to a certain extent, that's likely to increase emissions compared to domestic production, but that is contingent on our production going down this pathway of increased efficiency and lower emission, particularly in that world, as Vera says, of emission trading schemes, but the carbon border adjustments as well.
Thank you, Dave. Ariane Burgess.
Thanks, Convener. I just wanted to pick up, and I think maybe, Claire, you were kind of saying it, but I'll just see if... so in the previous panel, Nim Keebler talked about how we need to move away from not just looking at cow numbers, but to look at the... Don't look at the cow, look at the... I think she really meant the practices of the herdsman or woman. And so that it's not just about having a cow, it's about how you work with a cow. And I mentioned... in the previous session that I had gone to see the work of Jock Gibson and Murray, and my sense is that could we be looking at more farmers doing that kind of practice across the whole of Scotland? Is it something about we could keep a certain number, and then there is the issue, the balancing act of the kind of throughput, you know, the throughput of the number of cattle to keep the abattoirs running and all that kind of stuff. But could we be looking at smaller size herds in more places potentially, or and I guess also what she was getting at was the holistic aspect of how those cattle or sheep are raised.
Thank you for that question. Absolutely. I think what is really interesting about farms such as Jock Gibson's and others is that there's a whole range of practices, and I thought what's very interesting to see are practices like, for example, rotational grazing, which delivers for climate, it delivers for nature, but also importantly, it makes for a profitable business that is doing very well and that produces a very good quality product. So I think all those things are really, really important. What isn't there and what could be there, and I referred to this earlier, is a mechanism for transferring best practice, for sharing knowledge. There is a lot of evidence there, there's a lot of research, there's a lot of information, but certainly in putting, when we worked with the SAC Consulting linked to the Scottish Rural College, when we did our report on skills, what came across in the farmers' focus groups was that point. The knowledge is there, the information is there, the evidence is there, but having the mechanism to share the knowledge is the missing link. And it's not enough just to get, and you will have heard this from the earlier industry session, it's not enough just to have an enthusiastic farmer talking about what the best practices are. People need to be paid for their time spent showing a group of people around your farm is time that you're not spending farming. So this is being done elsewhere. It can be done here. It is being done in certain, I don't know the extent to which it is being done, but certainly we would like to see a more well set up ACIS that would facilitate these kind of sharing of best practices.
And from Emma Roddick, and if you'd like to also, on the back of that, just move on to your substantive question.
Thanks, Convener. Yeah, I wanted to ask about changing behaviours around consumption. One thing that constantly comes up in conversations with farmers is the need for people to eat seasonally, and it doesn't feel like this is a message that has got out to the wider public, but that could reduce our need to keep importing food that's out of season here. Do you have any ideas on how the Scottish Government could encourage that better or bring in policies that would force that behaviour change?
Thank you very much. I think what is really important in this is what our goals are. If we stick to the climate question and especially GHG emissions, then we need to refer back to the question of how much transport emissions are a problem. And as Dave said, they are minuscule. So eating out of season, eating important food is not really the problem. Because the emissions from and the land use from livestock-based protein is roughly 5 to 10 times larger than plant-based protein. So that's where our big savings are. So it can be important to eat seasonally for many other reasons, but in the last 20 years, I've studied the literature on GHG mitigation. Eating seasonally is not a solution for that, unfortunately. So because of that, I don't really have opinion. But of course, markets and import prices and price ratios do matter, and trade agreements do matter in that sense.
Yeah, because we talked a bit in the last panel about shipping lamb across the world and overproducing what we need here. Is that kind of behaviour change then something that's more for us to focus on in terms of eat what is being produced near you?
Oh, I think on the lamb specifically, what is happening is that most of the lamb we produce gets shipped out and we get in cheaper lamb. And that's a question of course, willingness to pay and how much money people have and ready to spend on lamb. So it's a market question in much of it. Much of it is a market question. And whether we want to change that or not, that's down to the sector. For the GHG, it won't solve our problems, unfortunately.
What about deer then? Is there more work to be done around managing deer numbers and using that venison?
Yeah, I think that's really marginal as well, because venison is also a ruminant that also comes with a lot of methane emissions. That's not out of jail card either. Okay. Sorry for being disappointing.
Thank you. Ariane Burgess.
Thanks, Convener. So we've already started to touch on the food system and the need for it to be integrated. But the draft plan focuses mainly on agricultural production, but says much less about the wider food system, things like consumption, waste, dietary changes. I'd be interested to hear from your perspective, is this a gap? And I think somebody's already kind of said it is a gap, that we're not actually talking about that as part of the climate change plan. And if so, what kinds of policies would help to close that gap?
Vera, I think you touched on that in some of your earlier responses.
Yes, a quick recap on that. So definitely I would just to recap just a few numbers that by the technical changes only, which are really important, and ACES and all that, and good practice is really important. We could get down to 5.5 megatons annually by 2050 by not changing anything on the farms technically, but changing the consumption and production patterns, shift for more plant, less livestock, not zero livestock at all, which could bring us down to below 4.5. If we combine the two, we would be below 4. So that's a huge difference we can achieve if we have a combined effort on both consumption and production. And on production, on the consumption side, answering your question, I think, again, it needs to be looked at just as with any sector and production as well as a progressive policy making. No policies are static. Policies need to be started off, or changes, transitions in society needs to be started up with softer policies, lots of information, lots of help to people to change and to anticipate. And there needs to be a credible policy threat that down the line in 5, 10, 15 years' time, much stronger policies will need to come in if voluntary policies don't help. And that needs to be the case, in my opinion, on the consumer side, because I can't see any examples in the past where really consumer change or behavior change happened just because people were asked to do so.
Can I just pop back in on a sup on that specific bit, because Henry Dimbleby in the UK report, the food report, and again in the book that came out of that, Ravenous, talked about, and I was surprised, that people would only need to stop eating meat for 2 days. If they're out of their normal diet, they would only have to reduce the meat by 2 days. I thought that was interesting, and I just wonder if you've got any thoughts around that.
As far as I remember, the balanced pathway in the CCC suggests a 1/3 reduction roughly on ruminant and dairy, and less reduction on white meat, that's poultry and monogastrics. Okay. So it doesn't exactly tally with the 2 days out of 7, but kind of.
Similar.
Yeah, similar, yes.
Again, it is depending on if you were looking at the livestock sector purely from a greenhouse gas emissions perspective, and I think Vera has spoken very well to that. What is really important, though, and for example, in WWF, we take a very holistic approach to this and talk about the kind of triple challenge of how do you tackle the climate crisis, how do you restore nature, and how do you give people food to eat and communities to support that. And I think looking at that more in the round, there is a lot that can be done from, linking to the Good Food Nation plan, linking, again, we would like to see the climate change plan making better links to the Good Food Nation plan and the dietary goals. And I think that would be the main point, that when we start to look at diet, it's looking at it in the round, but also, as has been said elsewhere, if there isn't an industry here to create locally grown food and to produce livestock here, then we don't have an industry. And again, WWF advocates less but better and more local, and I think that's an important point to bring across when it comes to red meat, for example.
Okay, and I would like to move on to your next question, unless it have Emma Roddy, do you have a supplementary on this? No. Can you move on to your next question, okay. Ariane? Thanks.
Yeah, sure. So this is moving on to peatland and trees. And so we heard that farmers and croppers are central to delivering peatland restoration and tree planting. based on the evidence. I'd be interested to hear if the current support and advice, is it strong enough and well enough integrated to make that happen at scale? And again, if not, what's missing?
David Mackay.
Yeah, thanks, convener. I think that there's a very good example in the climate change plan about Cora and David Cooper, who are farmers, upland farmers, who have been doing peatland restoration work whilst maintaining, well-managed grazing systems. And it's really good to see that there are positive examples of that happening. I think that one of the things we'd like to see, in addition to that, is where we have a target for peatland restoration, we have targets for woodland creation. What we don't have are targets for agroforestry or hedgerow creation. And this was something that was picked up by Nature Scott in its response to the Net Zero Energy and Transport Committee. And they're also advocating for targets. I think that this would set a very clear intention from government that this is something that it wants to see happening. There are schemes in place already. So, for example, on agroforestry, there are grant options through the Forestry Grant Scheme. We think that those need to evolve, and there are some gaps, for example, around more low-density agroforestry systems, and we've submitted very detailed proposals on that with payment options. Similarly, on hedges, we think there's a big opportunity there to restore many of the thousands of miles of hedgerows that have been lost over the past decades. And this would deliver not just in terms of mitigation, but also climate adaptation, which is going to become increasingly important. And we're already seeing the impacts of climate change. So I think for farm businesses, particularly those that have livestock, then they really should be thinking about integrating trees into those systems for the health and welfare of their animals in future, and thinking more about shade and shelter from heat, possibly even more so than from more inclement weather. But at the moment, there's lots in the climate change plan saying that Scottish Government wants to see this happen. So it's good that that the political argument for integrating trees has been widely accepted. I think what's missing is those specific targets to really set a very clear intention to the industry and to drive uptake.
Thank you. Dave Ray.
Yeah, I agree with what David just said. And to Ariane's question, one of the key things on the ground, I think we've got the potential mechanism through the whole farm plan to actually drive this in terms of us understanding if you've got land where the potential is. We might already know that as a landowner or a farmer, but actually that ACIS bit or Farm Advisory Service bit being tooled up to actually help us with where that could go, how we monitor it, what the funding support is going to be over time, that kind of that on the ground level, unlocking that. I do, like I said earlier, I have a lot of time for the ethos behind the whole farm plan, if it leads beyond just a kind of baselining to actually well-informed advice in terms of what you do on your farm or your croft in terms of tree planting, agroforestry, and hedgerows. So, the potential's there, it's just not being realised.
Thank you. Vera.
Thank you very much. Well, I would like to add to this three very quick points. Is one, kind of reconciliation, all this demand and how we would like to see Scotland's land being used for peatland, for afforestation, for biochar production, for biomass production, for livestock, for flood protection, for all that is really important, and that's missing in the CCP. The CCP mentions quite a few of these documents, which is great, but having all these things together and reflecting policies on each other and having some sort of idea of if I put a lot more land to sequestration or wetland creation or restoration, how will that affect our grasslands or urban lands? And same about biomass production, which probably needs to happen in kind of prime good capacity areas. So that's one thing. The other thing is, which I heard from colleagues about peatland and both forestry, is that the targets are area-based. That might mean missing the emission targets linked to them, because it could be that the restoration doesn't happen as well, or the dams fail, or the forest falls because of natural or man-made reasons. So that's also really important. And the last bit is that so far, how economics works is that especially peatland restoration, probably afforestation happened in the areas and places where it's relatively cheap to do so. So the Scottish Government and Scotland needs to anticipate that the unit cost is going to increase as we go into more difficult areas, less accessible areas, and the maintenance of these things are not necessarily as well funded as the transition for revetting or afforestation. And I totally agree with all the other points the others have just said.
You mentioned a number of times, twice in the session so far, about trees falling, which is a very real thing. We see that from all the Storm Marwyn, so on and so forth. Do we need to be thinking more of a joined up approach, where we actually not looking at the carbon sequestered in a forest, but that actually we take that and it's timber that goes into housing where it can't fall down?
Yes, thank you very much. That's also really important, and that way it can be logged up at least for a few decades or even 100 years, though that's usually unfortunately, a relatively small part of the total biomass produced, because you need certain quality and size of the wood. But definitely, and looking at adaptation, pests, diseases, but also fires increasingly, unfortunately, will be important. Wetland restoration can help to reduce some of that.
I'm going to move on to a question now from Evelyn Tweed.
Thanks, Convener, and good afternoon, just witnesses. Thanks for all your answers so far. This is kind of a huge question, and you've all kind of touched on it already, but what do you think a good final climate change plan for agriculture would look like? And even if you could all give like a short summary of key things that you want to see in it. Who would like to kick off?
Claire?
To go. Again, we have touched on it already, but a good climate change plan would have more of the measures that we set out in our 2020 report on delivering net zero, looking at a whole range of measures that I think have already been touched on, legumes in grassland, legumes integrated with rotational grazing techniques, possibly additives to reduce methane, agroforestry, organics, targets around organics. There's a range of measures. They have been set out in terms of their emissions reductions potential, and seeing more detail on that. Another thing that a good climate change plan would have is detail on what's going to be delivered by the measures and what's the cost. Another thing, I'm going through a wish list now, it's starting to sound like. Another thing that would be, again, signposting to other policy areas and co-benefits that can be realised, because then we're talking bigger savings and wider societal savings and health savings in the NHS. And last but not least, as mentioned earlier, a fit-for-purpose, properly funded ACIS system, and that can share best practices, that rewards farmers for the knowledge that they share. And yes, that would be it. So there's still time for the climate change plan to move from draft to final.
Okay, thanks. David Mackay.
Yeah, thank you, Convener. I think I agree with all that that Claire's just outlined, so I won't repeat it. I think the thing to add from a Scottish Environment Link perspective would be a clear signal that in the next Parliament, so for that period 2026 to 2031, that we will start to see a phased shift in how the budget is allocated across the tiers, with the intention that more of the funding will be going towards incentivising and rewarding the types of practices that we've been talking about and that Claire has just helpfully listed, including that very important piece around advice. I've just talked about targets for agroforestry and hedgerow creation. I think those should also be in there. And I think also one of the things we haven't really touched upon today is that, in the plan, it does say that there's abundant evidence that the twin crisis of climate change and biodiversity loss are linked and mutually reinforcing. So we agree with that. However, when you look at the carbon budgets in the later period, we are then looking to rely quite a lot on more technological fixes. So starting from feed additives, but also the commercialisation of smart sheds and alternative fuels and fertilisers. Our concern about that is that it risks kind of locking in a business as usual approach, but also risks further intensification of agriculture. So, for example, the green sheds are a fantastic invention, but they require animals to be housed in order for emissions to be captured. Likewise, with some of the feed additives that are being talked about, animals have to be in a shed in order to be fed those, and there's a challenge there for, given how much of our agriculture is extensively grazed. So just a kind of caveat there on some of that direction of travel and some of that reliance on the more technical fixes, we think risks creating tension with delivery on some of the other objectives of the Agriculture Act. So thinking about, in particular, on-farm nature restoration and animal health and welfare. So I think that's something that the plan perhaps needs to reflect, is that we're trying to achieve multiple things here, and sometimes, whilst you may achieve emissions reduction, there may be perverse outcomes, particularly for animal welfare and for biodiversity.
Thank you. Dave Ray.
Thank you. Yeah, briefly to add to that good wish list from Claire and David, it would be robust monitoring, reporting and verification, so indicators of how progress is or isn't being achieved, and as part of that, contingency plans if they're not being achieved. And so, that is something which is reliant on having, if you look at the draft or the example rural support plan, because I haven't seen the draft, it sounded like earlier someone's seen it, in terms of a real one, but the example one from a couple of years back had indicative indicators. You would want a good set of robust indicators which, if we're failing on as a country, ministers can pick that up early and say what they're going to do to get us back on track in terms of the measures to deliver the outcomes, whether that be emission reductions, just transition or biodiversity outcomes.
Thank you. Vera? Briefly.
Yes, being the last one, I can be very brief. I fully agree with Claire and David and Dave's point for supporting the whole transition. And I would just come back to the point that a credible, really strong policy goal needs to be at the end, and we need to stop backtracking and saying something in the CCPU in 2020 and still not much of that have been delivered. Just gives the message that we can just carry on business as usual. We need much stronger policies, and ideally that the CCP would plan out what would be the way to agree and discuss it with the whole industry, like in Denmark they have said, and the NGOs, that what really is our pathway. Thank you.
Thank you. Any further questions, Evelyn?
Yeah, I was just going to ask Vera and others, you're talking about other countries. Are there policies and good practice that we can import from other countries? And I think maybe Claire had touched on that as well. So if there's any specific things that you think we should be looking at?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for me, the nice examples I've seen is that in the past, so we shouldn't forget necessarily about regulatory approaches, which are not voluntary and can come with financial, but mostly it's kind of technical standards. And Denmark, Netherlands and north of Germany have achieved really substantial nitrogen water pollution reductions via those regulatory standards, which kicked off market action in the whole farming community with the advisors as well, and with technological solutions, especially on manure management. And it has been a progressive really strengthening policy, regulatory policy approach. And I think that's a really nice example, even if they are not doing so well right now. And the other very nice example is Denmark, where they have managed to get together all the interested parties over years and have an agreement on the pathway. And they have agreed to diverge from the EU way and have stronger policies for agriculture, despite Denmark having a major livestock exporter. So I think we can look at those examples a bit more thoroughly.
Okay, thank you. Anybody else like to briefly comment? No. Sorry, Claire.
Myself and David Mackay had discussed when we were catching up last week. So it's David's example, but I'm jumping in there again. The Republic of Ireland has a 10% goal for 10% organic by 2030, and again there are measures put in place leading towards that. But there are some better international examples as well, I'm sure.
Thank you. I'm very conscious we're rapidly running out of time. We've still got a number of questions, so again, can I ask people just to be succinct with their questions and answers. A question from Marianne, beg your pardon, I've got a supplementary from Emma Harper.
Thanks, Convener. I won't take long. I mean, I've been really interested in hearing about everything, especially like other countries and what they're doing. Our draft climate change plan, it says it doesn't mention diet specifically, but I guess this question would be, does it need to, or does it just need to point to the population health framework and the Good Food Nation plan? And our climate change plan does mention healthier food, which to me might link with not ultra high processed food, which may or may not contribute to climate emissions because of supply chains, movement of products, wrapping, packaging and all of that. So, you know, our food system is really, really complex. And, you know, and I'm thinking about also the fact that, you know, we've got 180,000 dairy cows in Scotland, but there's 300 million sacred cattle in India and an estimated 11 to 14 million dairy cows in China. So, you know, rather than reduce our herd, we need to look at what the technology and the genetics and things like that is doing. So I guess it's hard to get questions in when you're remote. But I'm just interested to hear about what our climate change plan, should it contain diet-specific info, or should we focus on population health framework, for instance, and Good Food Nation plan?
Vera?
Thank you. A very succinct answer. Thank you very much for the question. What we discussed before, if we don't tackle the livestock numbers and livestock emissions, we have a really high risk of not reaching the net zero target. So my answer to your question, yes, we need to look at livestock, but also we can't look at production only without consumption, because reductions achieved via only the technological changes you mentioned and other mentions will not be sufficient, unfortunately, to get to net zero. So we need to look at consumption. If we need to look at consumption, it's not enough to point to health plans for two reasons. One is that there aren't any strong policies on there either, and the other is that they don't have to quantify and they don't have to really think about the GHG effects. They have to think about the health effects. So somewhere the GHG effects need to be sorted out and looked at, and the two goals reconciled. They are similar, but they are not completely the same. So I think they have to acknowledge each other and have to have details about each other's policies in both places. Thank you.
David.
Thank you, Convener. I'll be brief. It's been touched upon already in this session that the CCP is basically silent on diet. So I do think it needs to be in there. I think that if you look at the Scottish Government's dietary goals for Scotland, the recommendation in terms of red meat of 70 grams a day, more than a third of adult meat consumers are eating more than that. So I think that if we're eating in line with what we're being told to eat, then that would make a difference. I also think, as has been said before, there is a gap in the plan in terms of any substantive reference to the National Good Food Nation plan, and that feels like an admission. That's something that I think the plan should be linking to very, very strongly.
Thank you. Ariane, can I ask you just to keep your question brief, please? Thank you.
Thanks. So this is a question around uptake and behaviour change. So Annex 3 assumes that 45% of uptake of low carbon assumes 45% of low carbon measures across the sector, and that much of that's going to start in 2030. So it's going to leave little policy-driven reductions for Carbon Budget 1. But I just want to get a sense from you, bottom lining, I think we've been hearing it already, but is that really realistic? And in practice, what tends to limit the uptake at that scale in farming systems, and what actually helps change spread beyond the early adopters?
To kick off, Vera.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think reaching 45% within that time frame could be realistic, but I don't think that the subsidy-based policy will deliver that without putting in a lot more money into it, because the barriers at the farm scale span from just finances to time to consider to major change in the whole farming business because of that, or even technological knowledge or the availability of advice, technical advice, and it's a very complex system. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. On the back of that, if it doesn't work, Tim's question will address that. Tim Eagle.
So just two quick questions, I think, to finish, actually. The first one of those is around contingency. To what extent, if we don't get the behavioural changes that are sort of being looked for in the climate change plan, do you think that actually we need to have sort of contingency built into the plan? And what would that look like if we do?
Okay, we'll just carry on, Vera, and then we'll move to the other.
So, of course, it's a policy question, but a contingency can be something which we do still within the sector, either chucking a lot more money on subsidies or very drastically changing the policy mix without having a progressive, gradual change, or it can be massively scaling up emission removal technologies, especially the permanent ones, but they are currently really expensive, probably around £1,000 per tonne CO2 equivalent, so that would cost a lot of money.
Yeah, okay.
Thank you.
Claire?
Yes, there does need to be a contingency, but I would caution against contingencies that are pushing action further down the road and that are overly reliant on technical nets and other technical solutions. A lot of the tools are there now. It's just a case of, again, going back to what was talked about earlier, which is instead of in sort of 10, 15 years' time having to jump off a cliff, you're just moving gradually and implementing stuff now.
Okay. Dave Ray.
Yeah, not much to add other than obviously the contingencies. We need them across the climate change plan, and that's where it's hard to see them because we can't see the working. But if you're looking at contingencies to deliver net zero for Scotland, then, you know, if we're failing in one sector, either, as Vera says, you need to go really much harder at that sector in one way or another sector needs to shoulder the burden. And like I said earlier, that's a real risk, I think, for our sector in terms of agriculture. As we get to, say, 2040, if the other sectors aren't delivering, then they're going to look at us. So we need to see what those contingency plans might be so we can identify the risks that would then maybe put on livelihoods and people who work in agriculture versus other sectors.
Thank you. David?
I don't have too much to add to that. I mean, in preparation for this session, I did read the SPICE briefing, and they made this very point that there's no discussion around contingency. And I do think there is a risk here that because of that reliance, particularly at the back end and the more technical fixes, you know, will we see, you know, for example, farm machinery that's decarbonised, available and affordable at scale. And you talked about that in your last session. I've seen presentations on methane-powered tractors, and there's lots of things going on in the manufacturing industry. But for me, it feels unlikely that there's going to be mass uptake or affordability of that type of technology within the next 10, 15 years. So I do think Dave just outlined what that contingency might look like. And the risk, I think, with agriculture is that as we get closer to these deadlines of 2040 and 2045, if we're still in this position where we're not achieving those emissions reductions, then I think, as Vera mentioned earlier, the policy options start to become a bit more severe. And I think there are examples elsewhere in Europe where, things that perhaps might be certainly not part of the discussion here, but in Denmark, for example, we've got our climate tax on agriculture coming in the next couple of years, and other countries are doing things which may be considered more radical. And I think some of those measures might end up on the table for discussion if we continue to flatline in terms of agricultural emissions in Scotland.
Thank you, David. And final question, Tim.
So it's probably a question aimed at Professor Ray, given some of the work that he's been involved in. But there appears, if I'm right in saying this, that there is no just transition indicator for the agriculture sector, or perhaps more widely the rural communities. Do you think that's a glaring omission in the plan?
Yeah, I mean, a big glaring omission outside the plan is we haven't got a just transition plan for land use and agriculture yet. So that is something which we were hoping to see this parliamentary term and was expected last year. We've got a kind of draft consultation document, and it would have been great to have that, to actually, for the CCP and the agriculture sections, to be able to refer to that. And my concern is that if we look at the draft rural support plan, I call it the draft, so the example one from 2024, there's nothing about just transition in terms of tier one. So there's nothing in there that really speaks to the fact that this needs to take account of the diversity of farmers and crofters in Scotland, and that there's the risk if you apply major transformations in policy and rural support, which are needed to address climate and nature crises, that they will fall, the burden will fall most heavily actually on the shoulders who are least able to bear it. And so I've got a concern there. I am reassured if we look at things like implementation of calving intervals, that actually the derogation there speaks to the fact that, Scottish Government do listen to, I guess, us as a community, to small farmers, to crofters, and our representatives, to kind of say, you need to have a more nuanced approach, and just transition is crucial for us. I think for the sector as a whole, our voice is probably less loud than it is in the energy sector, because it's a much more diffuse community, but the risks are just as acute, if not more so, in terms of unjust transitions. So I think it would have been great to have that just transition plan for land use and agriculture finalised before the climate change plan. I think the climate change plan itself, the key for me is looking at those indicators. So we've got just transition indicators in the climate change plan, which is, I think, a world first, and I really do applaud the Scottish Government for including them in the draft. For the sectors, and particularly our sector as agriculture, they need to speak loudly, I think, for our community and our stakeholders. And at the moment, those indicators that are listed in the example rural support plan don't really talk about just transition. They talk about job creation. They don't talk about the quality of those jobs, how they are dealing with the fact that we are very much an ageing workforce, and in many of our regions, including mine, we're seeing rapid depopulation as well. So how actual rural support to address climate change is also going to address those key just transition challenges. That would be great to see. So we will, in the final version, hopefully we'll see those indicators actually speaking to agriculture through a just transition lens.
Thank you. Anyone else like to comment on Tim's question? Claire.
Just a small point to make, and completely agree with what David said, and thank you for the question, Tim. The main point is that despite being framed as income support, for example, the current system of payments doesn't support those who need the support the most. And instead, distribution of funding is weighted towards those who are making the highest claims. And David has talked about this as well, that we need farming systems that are valuable to nature, and in some case, funding supports do. At the moment, some funding supports do create damage to nature. So getting that balance better and getting a better balance in the payment system, I think, will make a big difference, and having a direct reference to that in the climate change plan.
Thank you, Claire. Move on to questions from Edward Mountain.
Okay, you won't be surprised that I want to look at Annex 3. I'm going to take you to page 67, where it quite clearly says that because of the slow development of the ARP, that it's impossible to fully assess the costs and benefits to the industry. So therefore, all figures should be treated as provisional. That's the carbon reductions and the costs. So let's turn to page 72, and there's a chart there of what it's going to cost. And it says that the benefits over the period of the plan to the industry are to the environment is 9.6 billion. And the net costs are, over the same period, of 90 million. But the problem is, in my mind, that the costs of the agricultural support scheme, if you top them all up, which they're rolling it forward, is 12.8 billion. And so none of the figures match up. So I wondered if those people who've considered the plan can tell me how much it's going to cost farmers and how much it's going to cost the industry, because I can't work it out. So, Dave, you anticipated this because you smiled. I'll come to you first. You must know the answers.
I wish I did, and I was looking for the climate change plan to give me those. It's not in there, so I haven't got the answer, and clearly neither have they.
Does anyone have the answer? Vera?
No,
answer.
But what we had as a recommendation on making it clear, not only the numbers, but it's not even clear that from whose perspective the costs and benefits are estimated. Is it a societal perspective, or farmers' perspective, or industry perspective, or policy budget, taxpayer money? That's a really important distinction, which is not clear. It's not clear whether the non-monetary benefits are included or not. The carbon savings are costed based on a price and included or not. That's not clear either. And it's not clear whether the compliance costs and running the scheme costs are included. So I'm just with you and adding to your list of questions.
Anyone else like to comment on the costings? Claire? No?
Well, like that, this was one of the things that struck us from very early, an early look at the draft plan, that there is a lack of detail. There's a lack of costings linked to the measures, and there's a lack of detail on what they deliver in terms of individual measures, in terms of what they deliver in terms of greenhouse gas emissions reductions. In terms of costing and who's going to pay for this, I would draw the committee's attention to the report that was published by WWF this time last year, along with NatWest, which was looking at the financing, the roadmap to regenerative agriculture, and that looked at both public sector and private sector solutions on that. But it, just to summarise, very much outlined that it should not be farmers that shoulder the bulk of the burden for this.
I'll probably just end it there, but just to say we have an uncosted plan with provisional figures, with no idea who's going to pay for it and what the benefits are and who's going to benefit from it. Amazing plan to me. Thanks, Convener.
Thank you. On that note, we have no further questions, so thank you very much for your time this morning. That's been great value, and will help inform our report that we write for the net zero, to help inform the climate change plan when we towards finally agreeing it. So thank you very much, and I'll suspend the meeting for 5 minutes to allow a changeover. Thank you. So our next item of business today is consideration of a negative instrument, the Conservation of Salmon Scotland Amendment Regulation 2025. And I also welcome to the meeting Jackie Bailey, who's in attendance for this item. Has any members got any comments? Jackie Bailey.
Thank you very much, Convener, and can I thank you and the members of the committee for your considerable forbearance and for giving me an opportunity to speak. I do so on behalf of my constituents in the Loch Lomond Angling Improvement Association. This has become an annual fixture in my calendar whenever the Salmon Scotland Amendment Regulations 2025 are considered, and in this case, SSI 2025-390. You will also be forgiven for feeling a bit that this is a bit like Groundhog Day, because I see many of the same faces around the table that were here before. At the heart of this issue is a continuing problem with the reliability of the data used. I've been talking about salmon conservation and regeneration actually from 2017. I will not, you'll be pleased to hear, be rehearsing everything that I am going to said then, but it is remarkably consistent. Last year, I lodged a motion to annul the statutory instrument. I've chosen not to do so this year, but I do wish to assure the Cabinet Secretary, who I hope will read what's happened at committee, that I will do so in future if things don't substantially improve. Last year, officials in the Cabinet Secretary said that data about the catches on the River Endrick was robust. That was clearly an aspirational declaration rather than a factual one, and let me demonstrate why. Considerable engagement has taken place since last year between the Angling Association and Marine Scotland, and it resulted in the identification of new fisheries not previously known about, the identification of 2 stretches of the Endrick, totalling 1.3 kilometres, for which no ownership details have been established, and much more besides. This demonstrates what we have all been saying all along, that the data was not good enough and certainly not robust. This is true for other waters, and whilst I'm here representing Loch Lomond, there are others who share concerns about data. Now, the Association have invested considerable time and effort, and not for the first time, in trying to ensure that Marine Scotland have an accurate and complete view of Endrick fisheries and owners. Why it has taken repeated efforts over many years to get to this position is frankly more than disappointing, and it is little wonder that confidence in the process and the accuracy of the data is less than fulsome. The committee will, I'm sure, appreciate that having an accurate view of the fisheries and owners on the Endrick is one thing, but ensuring that owners return catch data is another entirely. And there are concerns that there appears to be no real enforcement or follow-up by Marine Scotland of the catch data. So we're faced with, again, relying on incomplete data on fisheries and owners, and incomplete data if returns are not made. As I said, when I look back to refresh my memory of our discussions, I was struck by it's exactly the same arguments that I'm making year after year, and the same arguments that the committee understands. And I am not one to just bring the committee a problem. I actually brought them a solution previously, and that was a suggestion to use fish counters as a means of removing subjectivity, removing the need to estimate catches, and it would bring real rigour to the process. My recollection is that the Cabinet Secretary thought it was a good idea, as did members of the committee. Disappointingly, in the time that has elapsed, nothing appears to have been done. Here is a relatively easy way of using quantitative data rather than estimates and assumptions. And I am nothing, convener, if not persistent, so I make the suggestion again in the same spirit as I did previously. But, you know, we cannot keep coming back, saying the same things, having the same conversations, because the data has not improved and nothing has changed. So I respectfully suggest that if Marine Scotland doesn't improve what it does, or at least trials the use of fish counters, and I offer the Endrick as a suitable site for it, I will regretfully be back here next year, this time with a motion to annul, because at the end of the day, we're actually not doing anything to help salmon conservation or regeneration if we keep relying on poor or incomplete data. Thank you, Convener, for the opportunity to speak.
Thank you, Ms Bailey. It also gives me the chance to comment. Anecdotally, there are more constituents like your constituents who have concerns about data capture. But given the difficulty in changing the methodology that the Marine Directorate used to calculate the health or otherwise of our rivers, they don't come forward anymore to suggest that we annul the instrument. But that doesn't mean there isn't any desire to see methods changed. The robustness of the data is incredibly important. From my constituency, we have a situation where, as we know across Scotland, the present system is generally based on rod catch or catches. So rivers that get fished more regularly and heavily there tends to be more fish caught, and so are graded higher. A good example is in Galloway, where we have the River Luce, which does support a healthy salmon population by modern standards, that is. Whether it's healthy or not, and historically, it is not clear, but it's a Category 3. And that is mostly due to the very light angling effort there is on that river, and also that the owners of the fishing rights there only allow fly fishing. So there's far more fish probably get away than there are caught compared with other rivers. So with a falling angling effort due to less angling, and also due to climate change, where we see weather conditions, including droughts and whatever, it means that river gradings are going to be less accurate. So there was a programme which was developed and widely welcomed by the Marine Directorate, and that was the National Electrofishing Programme Scotland, NEPS, which I believe started in 2018 and ran again in 2019, not in 2020 because of COVID, but in 21 and 23. But it's not been operated in 24 or 25 due to what I understand is a lack of funding. I think there was wide recognition that NEPS was a good project, which involved many of the trusts and those with an interest in rivers working together with the Marine Directorate to get a more accurate picture. And that, along with fish counters, because we did hear in previous sessions that the Marine Directorate did recognise how important fish counters were. So it gives me concerns that we've not seen a rollout of fish counters to make the data more accurate, but also concerns that the NEPS project has not been restarted and it's not attracting the funding which would remove some of the reliance on rod catch data, which is not as good as it may well have been in the past. Has any other members got any comments? Ariane Burgess.
Yeah, I was just interested about Jackie Bailey's solution around the fish counters. And I think in our papers it does say that the Scottish Government, that my understanding is that fish counters already feed into the annual assessment through the fish counter network. But I just wonder if the network is the concern that the network isn't comprehensive, or that the counters aren't in the right rivers, or that the data isn't being weighted properly.
Okay, that's certainly a question we can ask.
Well, yeah, I mean, maybe I don't want to put it on to Jackie Bailey, but maybe we could ask the government around. There are fish counters in their data gathering mix, but how comprehensive is it?
Yeah. As I say, I think from my memory, there was an understanding that fish counters were going to be rolled out more generally because they were seen as a very effective tool in accurate data collection. Emma Roddick.
I just wanted to come in and speak specifically. When Jackie Bailey was speaking earlier, she mentioned, this is a problem in her patch, but it will be replicated across the country. It certainly is in mine, and I know that fisheries organisations around Inverness, Invernessshire, are really keen to see fish counters introduced. It is something that I've been trying to get a meeting with government agencies about for quite some time at this point, and I understand there are some complications around who makes the decision and how many people are involved. So at this stage, I'm still trying to get a meeting sorted with Marine Directorate, Nature Scottish Government, but it does seem like something that most people are agreed on. This is the way forward.
Rhoda Grant.
I'm just kind of thinking about
obviously we're coming to the end of the parliamentary term. This is going to be a problem for the new committee, but they might, like us, be totally unaware of it until it kind of lands on their desk. So it might be something worth putting in our kind of annual report and information for the next committee, because they'll have time at the beginning of the session to look at things more in depth, and that they maybe look at this rather than react to an SSI appearing that they, by which time it's too late. It might just, we certainly got information about this, but it seems like it's not, it seems the basis of the decision making rather than what's being collected at the moment.
My suggestion would be that we follow up this agenda item with a letter asking specifically about the rollout of fish counters and potentially the continuation of the NEP scheme, but also as part of our legacy report, which we'll be dealing with at the end of March, we specifically have a section within that report to suggest and refer to the ongoing issues that committee members have, it's the problems that have been raised with the committee, and it's something that a future committee should look at and potentially doing a little bit of work that we've been unable to do at this time. Everybody happy with that? Thank you very much. Great. Thank you very much. Thank you, Ms Bailey. Thank you. That concludes our business in public, and we now move into private session. I close this meeting.